In April 1204, the men who entered Constantinople did not walk into a pagan city. They walked beneath Christian domes. Above them rose the churches of the Eastern Roman world, heavy with incense, mosaics, relics, and candle smoke. Marble floors carried the marks of centuries of prayer. Icons watched from walls darkened by oil lamps. The city had been the shield of Christendom for almost 900 years, the place where emperors had called councils, defended doctrine, and stared eastward toward enemies. Latin Europe often understood only from a distance, and yet the men breaking into its churches wore crosses on their clothing. They had not been sent, at least officially, to conquer Constantinople. The crusade had been preached for Jerusalem. Its purpose was supposed to be the recovery of the Holy Land, the defense of pilgrims, the renewal of a sacred mission that had lost momentum after years of failure and disappointment. But here, in the greatest Christian city of the East, the language of holiness had arrived carrying ladders, swords, torches, contracts, unpaid debts, and hunger. That is the image we have to begin with. Not because it was the first moment of the Crusades. It was not. Not because it explains everything by itself. It does not. But because in Constantinople in 1204, the contradiction became impossible to hide. A movement that claimed to serve God had become capable of destroying the altar of another Christian world. A war preached as salvation had learned to obey forces less pure than prayer. Money, shipping, prestige, revenge, political promises, and the old appetite of armed men standing before wealth they believed was now theirs by right of victory. To understand the Crusades, we should not begin with a clean map and numbered campaigns. We should begin with a broken icon. Imagine a church servant in Constantinople, someone whose name was never written into a chronicle, someone who knew the sound of footsteps on stone before dawn. Perhaps he had spent years trimming wicks, replacing candles, polishing metal, carrying water, opening doors for priests who moved through the half-light murmuring prayers in Greek. Then the doors are forced open. The voices are wrong. Latin, French, Venetian, men from the other side of Christendom, men who would have called themselves defenders of the faith, now move through the sanctuary with the urgency of soldiers who have been promised too much and paid too little. Metal scrapes against stone, cloth tears. Someone shouts near the treasury. A relic case is lifted. A jeweled object disappears into a sack. For the servant, the theological arguments between Rome and Constantinople would have mattered less than the immediate facts. Boots on holy floors, smoke in the air, hands reaching for sacred things. This was not the dream Urban II had offered at Clermont in 1095, or at least, it was not the dream anyone would have admitted aloud. The Crusades began with a sermon, but they did not remain a sermon. That is the first lesson. Once an idea enters the world, it must travel by roads, ships, coins, animals, documents, human bodies, and human ambition. It must eat. It must pay. It must negotiate with kings, merchants, bishops, sailors, princes, and men who discover very quickly that holiness does not cancel arithmetic. The Fourth Crusade revealed this with brutal clarity. Pope Innocent III had wanted to revive the crusading cause. By the end of the 12th century, the glory of the First Crusade had become memory. Jerusalem had been lost to Saladin in 1187. The Third Crusade, for all the fame of Richard the Lionheart, had failed to retake the Holy City. The Latin East still existed, but it clung mostly to the coast, dependent on ports, ships, fortresses, military orders, and a steady stream of men and money from the west. So a new crusade was preached. Its intended strategy was not simply to march to Jerusalem. By then, many planners understood that Egypt was the key to power in the eastern Mediterranean. Strike Egypt, weaken the Muslim center of wealth and grain, and perhaps Jerusalem could be recovered from a stronger position. On paper, that sounded practical. On water, it required Venice. Venice was not a monastery. It was a maritime republic, a city of shipyards, contracts, warehouses, salt air, oars, timber, rope, and commercial memory. Its leaders understood the sea as a ledger. If a crusade needed transport, Venice could build the fleet. If thousands of knights, horses, squires, and foot soldiers needed to cross the Mediterranean, someone had to calculate the cost. The agreement was enormous. The Venetians prepared ships, supplies, and transport at a scale that demanded money before glory could even begin. But when the Crusaders gathered, fewer arrived than expected. Fewer men meant less money. Less money meant a debt too large to ignore. The Holy Expedition was now trapped inside a commercial problem. This is where the old image of the Crusades, banners, vows, sermons, shining armor, begins to fracture. Because a crusade could be preached in the name of God, but it could not sail without sailors. It could promise salvation, but it still had to pay for wood, canvas, rope, food, harbor labor, and months of preparation by men who expected compensation. The first diversion was Zara. Zara was not a Muslim city. It was a Christian city on the Adriatic coast, contested by Venice and under the protection of the Hungarian king, who himself had taken the cross. When the Crusaders agreed to help Venice attack it in 1202, the moral line had already been crossed. Pope Innocent III condemned the attack. Excommunication followed, at least in part. Some Crusaders were horrified. Some refused to participate. But the army moved, not because every man suddenly stopped believing. That would be too simple. Many still believed. Many had taken vows seriously. Many feared damnation, shame, dishonor, and the ruin of turning back. But belief did not make them free. They were caught in a structure of debt, leadership pressure, logistical dependency, and military momentum. Once thousands of armed men had gathered far from home, after land had been sold, reputations pledged, and ships prepared, stopping became almost as difficult as sinning. Then came Constantinople. The route from Zara to the Byzantine capital was paved with political promises. A Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, offered the Crusaders money, military support, and church union if they would help restore him and his father, Isaac II, to power. To men already drowning in obligation, the offer looked like rescue. To Venice, Constantinople was not only a city of faith, it was also a city of commercial rivalry, ancient wealth, and strategic opportunity. The agreement promised too much. That is often how disasters enter history. Not as obvious evil at first, but as a solution too convenient for desperate men. The Crusaders helped place Alexios IV on the throne in 1203. But promises made in exile are easier than payments collected in a furious capital. Constantinople resisted the costs. The money did not arrive as expected. Anti-Latin hostility inside the city deepened. Political chaos swallowed the arrangement. Alexios IV fell. Alexios V Ducas took power. The Crusaders, unpaid and angry, now faced the city not as allies, but as enemies. In April 1204, they attacked. The sack that followed became one of the great wounds in Christian memory. The details vary by source. and medieval writers often shaped horror to serve argument. But the broad reality is not in doubt. Constantinople was looted, its wealth broken apart, its churches violated, its relics carried west, its people subjected to violence and humiliation. The Latin Empire was established in the ruins of Byzantine power, while Byzantine successor states struggled to survive elsewhere. A crusade had conquered the wrong city, and yet calling it merely the wrong city is too gentle. Constantinople was not a mistake on a map. It was a revelation. It showed what happened when sacred language became dependent on systems it could not morally command. The Pope could preach, clergy could bless, knights could vow. But ships had owners, debts had consequences, princes had ambitions, soldiers had hunger, cities had treasure. The cross did not erase these things. Sometimes it made them harder to question. That is why the Crusades cannot be understood only as wars between Christianity and Islam. They were also wars inside Christianity's own imagination. They forced medieval Europe to ask whether violence could be purified by intention, whether killing could become penitence, whether conquest could be pilgrimage, and whether a holy cause remained holy when it began to reward the men who knew how to profit from it. The answer was never stable. In one generation, crusading could produce sincere sacrifice, dangerous courage, and a sense of spiritual unity stronger than anything Latin Europe had known. In another, it could produce massacre, greed, political manipulation, and the destruction of a Christian city whose people prayed to the same Christ in a different tongue. This is not a story of pure hypocrisy. Hypocrisy alone is too weak to explain it. The darker truth is that many of the people involved were sincere. Urban II may truly have believed he was defending Christendom and healing a violent society. Poor pilgrims may truly have believed the road east could save their souls. Knights may truly have feared judgment. Kings may truly have felt the burden of sacred duty. Monks may truly have thought Jerusalem mattered not as territory, but as a wound in the body of faith. Sincerity made the movement powerful. It did not make it safe, because once the Church discovered that it could turn violence into a sacred obligation, it had created a weapon no one fully controlled. The idea moved through sermons and songs, through rumor and fear, through marketplaces and castles, through households where wives watched husbands mortgage land, through villages where sons vanished eastward, through ports where merchants counted what devotion was worth in silver. By the time Constantinople burned, the Crusades had already traveled a long road from their first promise. But the road did not begin in Venice. It did not begin in Zara. It did not even begin in Jerusalem. It began in a Europe that was violent, anxious, spiritually hungry, and politically fragmented. A Europe where knights were a problem, where the papacy was searching for authority, where pilgrimage already had emotional power, and where an emperor in Constantinople needed help against enemies pressing into Anatolia. Before the fire, there was a sermon. Before the sack, there was a crowd. Before Christian soldiers looted Constantinople, a pope stood in France and offered warriors something almost unimaginable, a way for bloodshed to become salvation. And that is where the story must turn next. Because history does not begin with ruins. It begins with choices that once looked righteous, urgent, even necessary. If you want more stories like this, where power is examined not as legend, but as a living system of faith, fear, money, and human consequence, follow the next chapter. There, we return to the world before the Crusades, where Europe had not yet marched east, but was already searching for a way to make its violence holy. Before the Crusades became ships on the Mediterranean, banners before Jerusalem, and blood on the stones of Constantinople, they began in a quieter place, a chapel. A knight kneels in the half-dark, chainmail cold against his body, the smell of wet wool and iron rising from him as candles tremble before the altar. Outside, the world he belongs to is not peaceful. Roads are unsafe. Fields are vulnerable. Local lords raid one another's lands over inheritance, insult, debt, boundary, pride. A village can be burned because two families of armed men cannot agree where one lord's honor ends and another's begins. Inside the chapel, the knight lowers his head. He has been told that violence stains the soul. He has also been raised to live by violence. That contradiction was one of the deepest problems in Western Europe before the First Crusade. The Church condemned bloodshed, but the aristocratic world depended on men trained to shed blood. Bishops preached peace, but they needed armed protectors. Monasteries prayed for order, but their lands could be threatened by the same class of men who endowed their altars. Kings claimed authority, but in many regions their reach was uneven, contested, and local. The result was a society that feared violence and admired it at the same time. By the late 11th century, reform-minded clergy were trying to discipline this world. The Peace of God and Truce of God movements had already attempted to restrain warfare by protecting non-combatants, church property, peasants, merchants, and sacred days from aristocratic aggression. These movements did not end violence. They revealed how serious the problem had become. The Church did not face a world without warriors. It faced a world full of warriors who needed a purpose. That is the first background to Clermont. Not Jerusalem, not yet. Before Jerusalem became the cry, Western Europe was struggling with a more immediate question. How could Christian society contain the armed men it had produced? A knight could be a defender of churches or a terror to them. He could donate land to a monastery after burning a neighbor's fields. He could confess his sins, receive penance, and then return to the same cycle of feud, raid, and revenge. The Church could condemn him, but condemnation alone did not solve the problem. A system built on mounted warriors cannot simply wish them away. Horses had to be bred, armor had to be maintained, castles had to be held, noble sons had to find honor, income, and rank. Younger sons, in particular, often lived under the pressure of inheritance structures that left them hungry for opportunity. Violence was not only a moral failure, it was a social language, and languages do not disappear because someone denounces them. They are redirected. Somewhere in a village in France or the Rhineland, a priest might stand outside a small stone church after a raid and count what was left. A door broken from its hinges, grain trampled into mud, a frightened family sleeping near the altar because they believed the walls of God's house might be safer than their own. The priest may have known the Lord responsible. He may even have blessed that Lord's father, baptized his children, accepted his gifts at Easter. This was the problem in miniature. The Church was not separate from violent society. It lived inside it. It depended on its gifts, feared its weapons, and tried to teach it restraint with tools that were often too soft for men who measured status in horses, swords, and land. Then came the East. In 1071, the Byzantine Empire suffered a catastrophic defeat at Manzikert against the Seljuk Turks. The battle itself did not instantly destroy Byzantine power in Anatolia, and historians rightly warn against treating it as a magical moment where everything changed overnight. But its consequences were severe. In the years that followed, Byzantine control over much of Anatolia weakened. Internal politics became unstable, and the empire's eastern frontier, long one of the great strategic buffers of Christendom, became dangerously exposed. For Constantinople, this was not an abstract crisis. Anatolia was not merely land on a map. It supplied men, taxes, roads, horses, fortresses, and depth. Lose too much of it, and the empire did not simply lose territory. It lost the space from which armies could be raised and enemies kept away from the capital. By the time Alexios I Komnenos came to power in 1081, the Byzantine state was under immense pressure. Normans threatened from the west. Pechenegs and other groups pressed in the Balkans. Seljuk power and Turkic groups challenged Byzantine recovery in Anatolia. The imperial treasury was strained. The army needed rebuilding. The emperor was skilled, pragmatic, and politically alert. But even a skilled emperor cannot summon manpower from empty air. So Alexios looked west. What he wanted was help he could manage. Probably troops, mercenaries, armed assistants that would serve Byzantine strategy, recover lost positions, and restore imperial control where possible. He did not ask for a social earthquake. He did not request a flood of armed pilgrims who would swear vows to God, follow their own princes, and arrive with expectations that did not fit neatly into Byzantine command. But requests change when they pass through other people's ambitions. At the Council of Piacenza in 1095, envoys from Alexios appealed for military aid. The appeal reached Pope Urban II at a moment when the papacy itself was searching for power. Rome had been locked in a long struggle over reform, clerical independence, and the right to command Christian society. The investiture controversy had revealed a brutal fact. Kings and emperors did not simply obey popes because theology said they should. Authority had to be performed. It had to be made visible. Urban II saw more than a military request. He saw a chance to do several things at once: aid Eastern Christians, direct Western knights away from internal violence, assert papal leadership over Christendom, and place Jerusalem, the emotional heart of Christian sacred geography, at the center of a new kind of mobilization. The genius of the idea was also its danger. It did not ask warriors to stop being warriors. It told them their violence could be transformed. That transformation mattered. Medieval Christianity already had a powerful culture of pilgrimage. Men and women traveled to holy places, seeking penance, healing, forgiveness, proximity to the sacred. Jerusalem held a place in the Christian imagination unlike any other city. It was the city of Christ's passion, crucifixion, and resurrection. To travel there was to move not only across geography, but through sacred memory. Urban's move was to fuse that older pilgrimage energy with armed action. A warrior could now become a pilgrim without ceasing to be a warrior. A sword could be carried toward a holy destination. A journey of penance could be made through battle. The knight kneeling in the chapel, afraid for his soul but trained for war, was being offered a terrifying resolution. He did not have to abandon violence if violence could be given a sacred direction. This was not a simple trick. It worked because it answered real needs. It answered the papacy's need for authority. It answered the knightly class's need for honor and salvation. It answered the Byzantine Empire's need for military aid, though not in the form Alexios expected. It answered the emotional hunger of ordinary believers for a task large enough to feel like redemption. It answered Europe's fragmented politics by offering one mission that could rise above local feuds, at least in theory. But a mission that answers too many needs is rarely pure. By the time Urban preached at Clermont in November 1095, the ingredients were already waiting. Aristocratic violence, reforming clergy, pilgrimage devotion, papal ambition, Byzantine vulnerability, and the magnetic power of Jerusalem. The sermon did not create these forces from nothing. It arranged them into a single command. That is why the First Crusade moved with such force. It did not have to persuade Europe to believe in violence. Europe already did. It did not have to persuade Christians that Jerusalem mattered. They already knew. It did not have to invent fear of Eastern enemies. The fear was available, sharpened by rumor and distance. It did not have to invent the desire for penance. Medieval society was saturated with anxiety about sin, death, judgment, and the fate of the soul. Urban's call gave all of that a road, and once there was a road, people began to imagine themselves walking it. A lord could see glory. A poor man could see deliverance. A monk could see divine purpose. A merchant could see movement. A younger son could see land or honor. A sinner could see forgiveness. A pope could see Christendom gathered beneath his voice. No single motive explains the Crusades. That is what makes them so dangerous to simplify. They were not merely greed wearing a cross. They were not merely faith carrying a sword. They were not merely a defensive war, nor merely colonial aggression, nor merely religious hysteria, nor merely papal politics. They were all of these pressures bound together tightly enough to move thousands of people across impossible distances. And yet, in that binding, the future corruption was already present. If violence could be sanctified, who would decide when it was holy? If the Pope could promise spiritual reward for war in the East, could similar logic later be turned against enemies closer to home? If a knight could march for Jerusalem to save his soul, what happened when his hunger, debts, ambitions, and fears traveled with him? These questions were not answered in 1095. They were carried east. Before the first armies reached Anatolia, before Antioch starved them, before Jerusalem fell in blood, the crusade existed first as an idea powerful enough to reorganize desire. It told a violent society that its deepest flaw could become its sacred mission. It told men who had lived by the sword that the sword might now open the road to heaven. For a moment, that must have felt like grace. It was also the beginning of a catastrophe. Because when violence is not destroyed but baptized, it does not stop being violence. It learns a new language. It gains new confidence. It becomes harder to restrain because it no longer sees itself merely as force. It sees itself as obedience. That was the world before the Crusades. A world of anxious priests, restless knights, wounded peasants, ambitious popes, threatened emperors, and sacred geography waiting to be turned into a battlefield. Urban II did not create the fire, but at Clermont he would give it a name, a destination, and a promise powerful enough to draw Europe toward the east. In the next chapter, the sermon begins, not as a clean transcript, not as a perfect quote preserved by history, but as a moment where salvation learned to march. The sermon at Clermont has survived as memory more than transcript. No stenographer stood beside Pope Urban II. in November 1095, catching every word as it left his mouth. What remains comes from later accounts, shaped by chroniclers who wrote with faith, politics, hindsight, and their own sense of what the moment ought to have sounded like. Some versions emphasize the suffering of Eastern Christians. Some sharpen the call to Jerusalem. Some give the crowd a single voice, crying out in sacred urgency. The exact words are uncertain. The consequences are not. Somewhere in that gathering, under the cold air of central France, a new form of power became visible. A pope spoke, and warriors began to imagine that the road east could cleanse what war had stained. The old language of pilgrimage did not disappear. It was armed. The old fear of sin did not fade. It was given a direction. The old hunger for honor did not die. It was stitched to the promise of heaven. That is why Clermont matters, not because one speech alone created the Crusades, but because it gave scattered pressures a single shape. Picture the crowd not as a neat painting of medieval unity, but as a dense and restless human mass. Bishops in heavy robes, lesser clergy, watching carefully, nobles measuring opportunity, knights listening for honor, poorer men catching fragments of a message that would travel faster than any official could control. Breath fogs in the air, horses stamp near the edges, cloaks are pulled tight. Somewhere, a hand closes around a sword belt. Then comes the command to go east, to aid Christians, to confront enemies of the faith, to move toward Jerusalem, the city that existed in medieval imagination, not simply as a place, but as a wound, a promise, a map of salvation written in stone. For generations, pilgrimage had offered Christians a way to make the body suffer in hope that the soul might be healed. A pilgrim walked because sin had weight. Roads, hunger, danger, distance. These were not inconveniences only. They were part of penitence, a journey to a holy place made invisible guilt visible through blisters, dust, exhaustion, and prayer. Urban's call did something radical. It did not replace pilgrimage with war. It fused them. A man could now take up arms and still imagine himself as a pilgrim. The sword did not cancel the vow. It became part of it. The road to Jerusalem was no longer only a path of humility. It could be a campaign, and the violence that had troubled Christian society for generations could be reimagined as service, provided it was aimed in the right direction and blessed by the right authority. This was the dangerous brilliance of the First Crusade. It made war feel like obedience. The people who heard the call did not all hear the same thing. A great lord might hear the chance to win glory greater than any local feud could offer. A younger son might hear the possibility of rank, land, or escape from a future too narrow at home. A poor believer might hear deliverance from a life of debt and hunger. A bishop might hear the extension of papal order. A sinner might hear the one promise no earthly reward could match: forgiveness. But once the cross was taken, private motive became public identity. That mattered. The cross was not an ornament. Soon onto a cloak or tunic, it turned intention into a visible bond. The person who wore it had marked himself before his neighbors, his family, his Lord, his priest, and God. To abandon the journey after such a vow was not merely practical failure. It could mean shame, spiritual danger, and public dishonor. Imagine a minor knight returning to his hall after hearing the preaching spread through the region. His household is small. His lands are not rich. The winter stores have to last. A horse must be maintained. A hauberk needs repair. The journey east will require money he does not have readily in hand. Still, the cross is cut from cloth A woman in the household, wife, sister, servant, mother, pushes the needle through wool. The sound is tiny, almost nothing, just thread passing through fabric. But with each stitch, the decision becomes harder to reverse. On a table nearby lie coins, a knife, a seal, perhaps a document concerning land to be pledged or revenue to be borrowed against. The holy vow has already begun to touch property. This is how sacred history enters ordinary rooms, not only through visions, sermons, and chronicles, but through the dull pressure of logistics. What can be sold? Who will manage the estate? Who will harvest the fields? Who will pay debts if the man never returns? Who will tell the children that their father has gone to Jerusalem because God has called him, and because everyone now knows he has promised to go? The crusade was spiritual. It was also material from the first stitch. That is the part heroic memory often tries to soften. To take the cross was not simply to feel inspired. It was to reorganize a household around absence. Land might be mortgaged to monasteries. Rights could be sold. Weapons had to be acquired. Animals had to be fed. Servants and retainers had to be gathered. A vow spoken in religious language became a financial event, a family crisis, and a local political fact. Urban's promise did not float above these things, it activated them. And because the promise was so powerful, it escaped the boundaries of elite strategy almost immediately. Preachers carried the message beyond carefully managed aristocratic circles. Rumor strengthened it. Local anxieties reshaped it. Men and women who had not sat in the councils of bishops began to imagine the East through fragments. Suffering Christians, desecrate places, enemies of God, the road to Jerusalem, the possibility that even a poor person might participate in the greatest sacred action of the age. The official version, as later writers would present it, was clean enough. Christendom had been called to aid the East and recover the holy places. The lived reality was messier. News moved through markets and monasteries, through noble courts and village churches. The message changed as it traveled. Some heard penance, some heard revenge, some heard rescue, some heard apocalyptic expectation, some heard opportunity, and no authority, not even the Pope, could fully control what happened once thousands of people began translating a sacred command into action. This is one reason the Crusades became so hard to contain. A sermon is spoken once. A movement repeats itself in thousands of mouths. By early 1096, the idea had already outrun the planners. Before the great princes had fully assembled their armies, popular movements began to gather. Poorer crusaders, minor knights, peasants, preachers, restless armed men, families, wanderers, all were drawn into currents of expectation that did not always distinguish between discipline and zeal. The road to Jerusalem existed in their minds before it existed under their feet. That mental road was filled with sacred geography. Jerusalem was not simply a distant city under Muslim rule. It was the place where Christ had suffered, died, and risen. To medieval Christians, distance did not reduce its emotional force. If anything, distance enlarged it. The city became more luminous because it was far away, more vulnerable because it was imagined through sermons, more urgent because most who took the cross would never have seen it. But imagination is dangerous when tied to armed movement. An enemy imagined from far away can become larger than any real person. A holy destination can make everything between here and there feel like an obstacle placed by God or the devil. A vow can turn uncertainty into pressure. Once a man believes his salvation lies at the end of the road, what will he do to anyone he thinks stands in the way? That question would soon find victims long before the Crusaders reached Jerusalem. At Clermont, however, the moment still held the appearance of order. There was a pope, a council, a sacred cause, a language of aid and penitence. The violence had not yet spilled into the Rhineland. The starving march through Anatolia had not yet begun. Antioch had not yet tested the Crusaders with hunger and terror. Jerusalem had not yet been taken in blood. There was still, for a brief moment, the dream. The dream that Western knights might stop tearing Christian lands apart and turn their weapons outward. The dream that aid to Byzantium might heal the broken edge of Christendom. The dream that the road to Jerusalem might cleanse sinners, unite lords, humble the violent, and bring order to a fragmented world. It is easy after Constantinople, after Zara, after the massacres, after centuries of memory poisoned by holy language and human cruelty, to see only the corruption. But the corruption mattered precisely because the dream had power. If no one had believed, the Crusades would have been only plunder. If no one had hoped, the betrayal would not hurt. The tragedy is that faith and ambition did not travel separately. They walked the same road, wore the same cross, and often lived inside the same human heart. This is what Clermont released. Not a single army yet, but a new permission. A warrior could become a pilgrim. A battlefield could become a path of penance. A pope could command across borders in the name of a universal Christendom. A man stained by violence could be told that violence, rightly directed, might become the medicine for his soul. The idea was intoxicating. It was also unstable, because once salvation learned to march, it had to decide who counted as the enemy of God. And the first answer would not wait until the Crusaders reached the walls of Jerusalem. In the next chapter, the road opens, and before the prince's armies reach the east, the Crusades' first victims will be found inside Europe itself. The road to Jerusalem did not open with kings. It opened with crowds. Before the great princes of the First Crusade had gathered their disciplined armies, before the banners of Godfrey, Raymond, Bohemond, and the other nobles moved east, another movement had already begun to surge across Europe. It was poorer, less organized, more volatile, and far more difficult to control. Men left villages with little more than faith, fear, and whatever food could be carried on their backs. Women and children followed some of the bands. Minor knights rode beside peasants, preachers, wanderers, debtors, beggars, and men who had heard enough of Clermont's message to believe that history itself had begun to move. The destination was Jerusalem, but many of them barely understood the road. To modern eyes, the journey looks impossible from the beginning. Thousands of people, poorly supplied, moved across long distances without the command structure, money, maps, discipline, or logistical planning that an expedition to the eastern Mediterranean required. But for the people inside the movement, impossibility was not always a warning. Sometimes it sounded like proof of faith. If God had called them, would God not provide? This was the danger of sacred urgency. It made delay feel like cowardice. It made planning feel almost suspicious. It made ordinary limits, bread, water, horses, safe passage, political permission, seem less important than the state of the soul. Among the most famous figures associated with this popular explosion was Peter the Hermit. Later tradition would make him larger than life, a ragged preacher burning with zeal, capable of drawing multitudes through the force of his voice and example. Historians still debate the scale of his actual influence, because the sources are shaped by memory and legend. But the broader reality is clear enough. Preaching spread beyond the careful control of councils and bishops, and thousands of people began moving before the official armies were ready. Some followed Peter, others followed different leaders. Some may not have known exactly whom they were following at all. They were moving because the idea had become contagious. A crusade preached as penitence had become a social current. In village after village, town after town, the question was no longer only whether Jerusalem should be recovered. It was whether one could stay behind while others took the cross. To remain at home might mean prudence. It might also look like cowardice, indifference, or spiritual failure. And once the crowd began to move, it needed food. Faith did not fill stomachs. In the spring and summer of 1096, these popular bands moved through regions of Western and Central Europe, often dependent on local supplies, charity, coercion, or plunder. They were not one unified army. They were a series of movements, some more violent than others, some more disciplined than others, all vulnerable to rumor, hunger, and apocalyptic expectation. This is where the crusade first revealed one of its darkest truths. A holy war does not need to reach its official enemy before it begins looking for enemies nearby. In the Rhineland, Jewish communities became targets. The cities of Speyer, Worms, Mainz, Cologne, and others held communities that had lived within Christian Europe for generations. They were not part of the military crisis in Anatolia. They were not holding Jerusalem. They were not the Seljuk forces pressing Byzantine frontiers. Yet, to crusading mobs and armed zealots, they became vulnerable to a brutal logic. If the army of God was marching against the enemies of Christ in the East, why should it tolerate those whom Christian polemic had long misrepresented and demonized at home? That question was not theology in a classroom. It became violence in the street. Imagine a Jewish household in Mainz in 1096, not as a symbol, but as a room, a table, a chest, a lamp burning low, manuscripts wrapped and hidden, coins buried or passed to someone trusted, children told to remain silent. Outside there is shouting, the pressure of a crowd, the sound of doors struck by weapons or stones. The air carries smoke, sweat, and the metallic fear that comes before a door gives way. A father might know the names of Christian neighbors. A mother might know which bishop has offered protection, and whether that protection will hold. No one in that room is thinking about Jerusalem as an abstraction. They are thinking about hinges, locks, hiding places, and whether the men outside believe murder can be made holy by direction. Some bishops and local authorities did try to protect Jewish communities. Their responses varied, and sometimes they were overwhelmed. In Speyer, protection seems to have limited the violence compared with the horrors elsewhere. In Worms and Mainz, the massacres were devastating. The details differ by source, and medieval accounts carry grief, accusation, and theological framing, but the central fact remains. Before the crusading movement reached the Muslim East, it had already turned its sanctified hostility against Jews in Europe. This was not strategy. It was not military necessity. It was uncontrolled sacred fear, sharpened by old prejudice and released by the language of holy war. The massacre of Jewish communities in 1096 is sometimes treated as a prelude to the real crusade, as if it were an ugly side event before the main story begins. That is a mistake. It belongs at the center of the story because it shows what crusading logic could do when detached from discipline. Once violence is described as service to God, the definition of the enemy becomes one of the most dangerous questions in society. And in 1096, that definition expanded before the armies ever reached the east. The popular crusaders did not only bring violence to others, they also brought disaster upon themselves. As they moved toward Byzantine territory, they entered a world far more complex than the sermons had made it sound. Roads required permission, markets required money. Local populations did not exist merely to feed passing armies. The Byzantine authorities, already nervous about Western warriors, now faced undisciplined crowds that could not easily be integrated into imperial strategy. Alexios Komnenos had asked for military assistance. He received human instability. When elements of the People's Crusade reached Constantinople, the emperor had every reason to move them across the Bosporus as quickly as possible. They were difficult to supply, difficult to command, and dangerous to keep near the capital. Once in Asia Minor, their lack of discipline became fatal. In October 1096, near Sivtor, forces associated with the People's Crusade were destroyed by the Seljuks. Poorly prepared and divided, they were no match for the military realities of Anatolia. The road that had seemed like a path of deliverance became a killing ground. The promise had outrun the structure needed to sustain it. That pattern would return again and again in the history of the Crusades. Sermons could raise armies faster than institutions could feed them. Vows could pull men from their homes faster than commanders could organize them. The idea of Jerusalem could fill the imagination more easily than anyone could fill wagons with grain. The People's Crusade collapsed because faith alone could not solve logistics. But its collapse did not discredit the movement. That is another important point. If the popular bands had been the whole crusade, the story might have ended in 1096 as a grim episode of zeal and failure. But behind them came the princes, better armed, better connected, more militarily capable, tied into aristocratic networks that could sustain a campaign at a far higher level. The disaster of the People's Crusade became, in a sense, a warning that the next wave did not fully absorb. It showed what happened when sacred energy moved without discipline. It showed how quickly the enemy could be invented before the official war began. It showed that Europe's violence, once blessed and released, did not travel cleanly toward one target. And yet the princes still came. They came with armor, horses, household knights, foot soldiers, priests, servants, cooks, wagons, ambitions, grudges, and vows. They came with a better chance of survival and a greater capacity for conquest. They had the political weight to negotiate with Byzantium, the military force to endure battle, and the aristocratic hunger to ask what would happen if cities taken for God could also become lordships for men. The People's Crusade had exposed the chaos. The Prince's Crusade would expose the ambition. Between these two movements, the First Crusade began to reveal its double nature. It was not one clean river flowing east. It was a flood made from many currents: penance, fear, poverty, nobility, preaching, greed, devotion, rumor, and violence. Some currents drowned quickly. Others carved kingdoms. But the first blood had already marked the road. Not in Jerusalem, not in Antioch, not on a battlefield between Latin knights and Seljuk horsemen. It had been spilled in the towns of Europe, where Jewish communities learned that the language of holy war could make neighbors dangerous, and where the Crusades' promise of salvation first appeared as terror at the door. That is why the next chapter cannot begin with glory. It must begin with hunger, heat, suspicion, and the long march through Anatolia, where the princes who claimed to serve heaven would discover that the road to Jerusalem passed through Byzantine politics, Muslim resistance, and the brutal question no sermon had answered clearly enough. When a city is captured for God, who gets to own it? The princes came with better armor. That did not mean they came with cleaner motives. After the chaos of the People's Crusade, the main armies of the First Crusade began moving east under men whose names would soon become inseparable from the story. Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, Tancred, Robert of Normandy, Robert of Flanders, and others. They were not one army in the modern sense. They were a coalition of armed households, noble ambitions, regional loyalties, religious vows, and personal rivalries held together by a destination more powerful than their disagreements: Jerusalem. But before Jerusalem, there was Constantinople. And Constantinople changed the temperature of the crusade. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos had already seen what uncontrolled Western zeal could look like. The People's Crusade had been difficult to supply, difficult to restrain, and easy for the Seljuks to destroy. Now came the princes, more disciplined, more dangerous, and politically more complicated. They were exactly the sort of warriors Alexios needed, and exactly the sort he could not fully trust. From the Byzantine point of view, the matter was clear. These Western armies were supposed to help recover lands that had once belonged to the empire. If cities in Anatolia were taken, they should return to Byzantine control. The crusading leaders, in turn, were asked to swear oaths to Alexios. Some did so reluctantly. The oath was not a small matter. To Alexios, it was the legal and political mechanism that turned dangerous foreigners into imperial auxiliaries. To the Crusader princes, it could feel like a leash. They had crossed Europe, sold or pledged property, gathered men, endured suspicion, and taken the cross in the name of God. Now, at the threshold of Asia, they were being asked to submit their conquests to an emperor many of them barely understood and did not naturally obey. The alliance was necessary. It was also unstable from the beginning. In 1097, the first major test came at Nicaea. The city was important to Byzantine strategy and dangerous in Seljuk hands, lying not far from Constantinople itself. The Crusaders joined the siege, but when Nicaea surrendered, it did so to the Byzantines, not directly to the Western armies outside the walls. From Alexios's perspective, this was order restored. From the Crusaders' perspective, it was a warning. They had fought. The emperor received the city. That tension would return. Soon after, at Dorylaeum in July 1097, the Crusaders faced the military reality of Anatolia. Seljuk forces, skilled in mobile warfare, struck hard against Crusader columns moving through difficult country. Western heavy cavalry and infantry could be formidable, but Anatolia punished confidence. Heat, distance, unfamiliar tactics, and the constant problem of water forced the Crusaders to learn that the road east was not a stage for easy glory. They survived Dorylaeum. Survival mattered. It gave the movement confidence that God still favored the road. But every mile after, that carried a price. Men died of thirst and disease. Horses collapsed. Armor became a burden under the sun. Supply lines stretched thin. The idea of Jerusalem remained bright, but the bodies moving toward it were increasingly exhausted. A crusade could be born in a sermon. It had to survive in dust. Imagine a foot soldier somewhere on the Anatolian road. Not a prince, not a chronicler, not a man whose name would become part of history. His shoes are worn. His lips are cracked. The leather of his belt has softened with sweat. He hears that the leaders are arguing again about routes, provisions, Byzantine guides, who owes what to whom, who will command, who will be honored when the next city falls. For him, the argument matters only because it changes whether there will be bread. The sacred mission is still real. He may pray at night. He may believe Jerusalem waits at the end of suffering. But belief does not prevent hunger from becoming physical. It does not stop flies gathering near the sick. It does not give water to animals whose death can ruin a night's military value in a single afternoon. This was the hidden truth beneath the heroic surface of the prince's crusade. Aristocratic command made the movement stronger, but it also made it political. Every success raised the question of ownership. Every city taken for the holy cause created a practical problem. Would it return to Byzantium? Would it be held by a Crusader prince? Would it serve the road to Jerusalem, or become the foundation for a new lordship? The men who marched east had sworn sacred vows, but they remained medieval nobles. They understood land, they understood tribute, they understood castles, titles, inheritance, and the prestige of command. No one embodied this tension more clearly than Bohemond of Taranto. Bohemond was a Norman, son of Robert Guiscard, shaped by a world of conquest and opportunity. He had fought against Byzantium before. He knew the Eastern Mediterranean was not only a spiritual landscape, it was a field of power. He could be brave, charismatic, calculating, and ruthless. To call him merely greedy would flatten him. To call him merely devout would be naive. He was both crusader and predator, and Antioch would reveal why that combination mattered. The siege of Antioch began in late 1097 and became one of the great ordeals of the First Crusade. The city was massive, fortified, strategically crucial, and psychologically overwhelming. Its walls stretched across difficult terrain. Its possession would open or close the road south. To take Antioch was not just to capture another city. It was to pass through a gate between survival and the possibility of Jerusalem. The siege dragged on through hunger, disease, desertion, fear, and internal suspicion. Antioch tested the Crusaders in a way no sermon could have prepared them for. Supplies failed, horses died, men ate whatever could keep them alive. Morale rose and collapsed with rumors. Byzantine support became a source of resentment and accusation. Some crusaders believed Alexios had failed them by not appearing with the relief they expected. From the Byzantine side, the situation looked more complicated, shaped by information, risk, and the difficult trusting these unpredictable Western armies. But on the ground, nuance rarely survives starvation. When men are hungry, betrayal becomes easy to imagine. Bohemond saw opportunity in the crisis. Through contact with a guard inside the city, known in many sources as Firuz, the Crusaders gained entry into Antioch in June 1098. The city fell, but the victory immediately turned into a new nightmare, because a Muslim relief army under Kerboga of Mosul soon arrived, trapping the Crusaders inside the city they had just captured. They had taken Antioch. Now Antioch might become their tomb. This is when the story of the Holy Lance emerged, According to Crusader accounts, a man named Peter Bartholomew claimed visions that revealed the location of the lance that had pierced Christ's side. The relic was supposedly discovered in Antioch, and for many Crusaders it became a sign that God had not abandoned them. Historians still debate the event, and skepticisms existed even at the time. The evidence is fragmentary, the emotional need obvious. But whether the relic was genuine, mistaken, or manipulated, its political meaning is clear. A starving army needed more than food. It needed permission to believe it could still win. The discovery gave shape to desperation. It transformed fear into momentum. Men who might have collapsed into surrender or despair were offered a sign that their suffering had meaning. Soon after, the Crusaders marched out and defeated Kerboga's forces. The victory was astonishing, and for those who survived it, easy to read as divine favor. But Antioch did not simply prove faith. It exposed ambition. Bohemond claimed the city for himself, arguing in effect that Byzantine claims had been forfeited. Raymond of Toulouse and others resisted, partly from rivalry, partly from concern over oaths, partly from their own interests. The road to Jerusalem had been delayed by the question that would haunt the entire movement. When God gives victory, which man gets the city? That question was not theoretical. Antioch became the foundation of Bohemond's principality. The sacred expedition had produced a territorial lordship. A Crusader prince had turned a moment of collective salvation into a personal political base. Again, this does not mean the crusade was fake. It means sincerity and self-interest could occupy the same battlefield. A knight might kneel in prayer before battle and still want land afterward. A leader might believe Jerusalem mattered and still maneuver to control Antioch. A chronicler might describe divine signs and still write within the factional loyalties of the army. The First Crusade was powerful because it did not require men to choose cleanly between heaven and ambition. It allowed them, for a while, to imagine both were moving in the same direction. That imagination made the march possible. It also made the moral danger harder to see. After Antioch, the crusade was no longer only a pilgrimage army passing through foreign lands. It had begun to plant Latin power in the east. The logic of holy war was becoming the logic of settlement, lordship, and frontier rule. Antioch had not been Jerusalem, but it had taught the princes what conquest could offer. The common soldiers still wanted to move south. For many of them, the vow had not been fulfilled. Jerusalem remained the center. Delays over Antioch, arguments among princes, negotiations, rivalries. All of this risked breaking the spiritual momentum of the movement. The lower ranks, the poor, the exhausted, those who had suffered without gaining cities, could pressure the leaders by the sheer force of expectation. They had not crossed the world to watch nobles divide Syria, so the army moved again, southward, toward the city that had haunted every sermon, every vow, every mile of hunger and dust. But the crusade that approached Jerusalem in 1099 was not innocent. It had already passed through massacre in Europe, political tension in Constantinople, battlefield survival at Dorylaeum, hunger before Antioch, disputed relics, and noble quarrels over captured territory. The dream was still alive, but it had been hardened by suffering and sharpened by appetite. Jerusalem would be the promised climax. It would also be the moment when the Crusade's central contradiction became impossible to sanctify away. Because when the walls finally stood before them, The Crusaders would not only ask whether God had delivered the city, they would show what men could do when they believed he had. Jerusalem appeared first as a shape against the heat. For the men who reached it in June 1099, the city was not merely stone. It was the end of a vow, the object of sermons, the destination that had survived hunger, desertion, disease, suspicion, and the long, brutal road through Anatolia and Syria. Many who had left Europe never saw it. Some had died in roadside dust. Some had vanished during the chaos of the march. Some had turned back. Others had stayed behind in cities conquered along the way. But now, for those still standing, Jerusalem was real. Walls, gates, towers, dust, sun, silence. The Crusaders had spent years imagining this place as a wound in Christian memory. Now they had to take it as a military target. That transformation mattered. Sacred geography does not surrender because men pray before it. A holy city under siege is still a city, defended by walls, supplied by wells, inhabited by people, protected by soldiers, vulnerable to ladders, engines, hunger, thirst, fear, and fire. At the time, Jerusalem was held by the Fatimid dynasty of Egypt, not by the Seljuks, who had dominated much of the Crusaders' earlier imagination. This alone reveals how much the reality of the East differed from the simplified world of Western preaching. The Crusaders had marched toward an enemy category. They found a political landscape. The defenders prepared. The Crusaders, exhausted and reduced in number, faced an immense challenge. They had no endless reserves, no easy supply, and no guarantee that a relief force would not arrive. The city they had dreamed about might still destroy them before they could enter it. The siege began. Heat pressed down on the army. Water was scarce. Wood for siege engines had to be found in a landscape not generous to desperate invaders. Men who had survived Antioch now faced another test of endurance, but this one carried a heavier emotional charge. Antioch had been a gate. Jerusalem was the promise. Imagine a crusader at night outside the walls, too tired to sleep, listening to the sounds of construction. Wood being dragged, rope pulled tight, hammers striking in the dark. Somewhere nearby, a priest murmurs prayers. Somewhere farther away, a sick man coughs into the dust. The city walls rise ahead, visible by moonlight, and every man knows that, if they fail here, the whole journey may become impossible to explain. What would it mean to come this far and not enter Jerusalem? That question gave the siege a dangerous emotional force. The Crusaders were not only attacking a strategic city, they were attacking the final proof of their own story. If Jerusalem fell, suffering became meaningful. If it did not, the dead along the road would remain harder to interpret. This is one of the reasons the capture, when it came, produced such intense violence. On July 15, 1099, the Crusaders breached Jerusalem. The details of the assault vary in the sources, but the outcome is certain. Latin forces entered the city after weeks of siege. Godfrey of Bouillon's men gained the walls from one direction. Raymond of Toulouse's forces were involved elsewhere. The defenders were overwhelmed. The dream became physical. The city that had existed for years as sermon, map, relic, and longing now lay open beneath armed men who believed God had carried them there. Then came the killing. Medieval accounts describe slaughter on a horrifying scale. Chroniclers wrote of blood, bodies, streets, mosques, synagogues, and panic. The exact numbers are uncertain, and medieval writers often used violent exaggeration to express moral meaning or divine judgment. But caution about numbers must not become caution about reality. A massacre happened. Muslim and Jewish inhabitants suffered. The city was taken not as a gentle act of restoration, but as a storm of conquest. The Crusaders had reached the holiest city in their imagination. They entered it through blood. For a Muslim resident trapped in the city, the Crusaders were not pilgrims. They were armed strangers speaking foreign tongues, breaking through defenses, turning sacred and domestic spaces into zones of terror. For a Jewish family seeking refuge, the language of salvation brought no shelter. For Eastern Christians in and around the city, the arrival of Latin power created a new political order that did not simply restore an old unity. The victory belonged to one version of Christendom. Others would have to live beneath it. Picture a survivor moving through the city after the assault. A broken water jar lies on the ground. A sandal is caught near a doorway. Smoke hangs in the air. The familiar streets are full of unfamiliar voices. In a house where a family had eaten the week before, soldiers now search for goods. In a sacred building, the sound of prayer has changed language. For the Crusaders, this may have felt like divine triumph. For the conquered, it was the end of the world they knew. That double vision is essential. The same event could be remembered as miracle by one community and catastrophe by another. The conquest of Jerusalem became the emotional summit of the First Crusade in Latin Christian memory. But the summit was built over the bodies of those who had not chosen to become symbols in someone else's sacred history. Soon after the city fell, the Crusaders moved to organize power. This was the next problem. A city can be imagined as holy from far away. Up close, it must be governed. Someone has to control gates, collect revenue, distribute property, defend walls, negotiate with local groups, secure roads, repair damage, and decide who has authority in a place claimed by God. The crusading vow had brought men to Jerusalem. It had not written a constitution. Raymond of Toulouse, one of the most powerful leaders of the expedition, refused certain forms of rule or became entangled in disputes over authority, depending on how the sources are read. Godfrey of Bouillon emerged as the chief ruler, though he famously avoided, or was later said to have avoided, the title of king in the city where Christ had worn the crown of thorns. The precise language of his title is debated in its symbolic details, but the political reality is clear. The Crusaders had to create a Latin government in Jerusalem. A sacred victory had produced a secular administration. This was not hypocrisy. It was inevitability. Walls require guards. Guards require food. Food requires land, taxes, villages, roads, and authority. A holy city cannot remain a devotional image. Once an army must defend it against counterattack. It becomes a capital, a fortress, a legal problem, an inheritance question, and a prize that rivals will measure. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was born from this contradiction. Its first challenge was manpower. Many Crusaders had fulfilled their vows and wanted to return home. They had survived the road, seen the holy places, and believed they had completed the greatest act of their lives. But if too many left, who would hold what had been taken? The conquest solved the spiritual problem of reaching Jerusalem. It created the political problem of remaining there. This is where the First Crusade's success began to reveal its weakness. The movement had been designed as an expedition, not as a permanent colonial society. It could gather men for a sacred goal, but it could not easily create a stable population. It could inspire sacrifice, but not guarantee long-term settlement. It could conquer a city, but the city sat in a region where Latin Christians were a minority, surrounded by powers that would eventually recover, reorganize, and remember. Victory had shortened the emotional story. It had lengthened the strategic one. In the weeks and months after the capture, property changed hands. Sacred buildings changed use. Latin clergy established authority. Political relationships were rearranged. The new rulers had to decide how to relate to local Christians, Muslims, Jews, Armenians, Syrians, Greeks, and others whose lives did not fit the simple categories of Western crusading rhetoric. The East was not a blank space waiting for Latin meaning. It was old, layered, crowded with memory, law, language, worship, trade, and local survival strategies. The Crusaders had entered it with enormous conviction and limited understanding. Yet for a moment, from the Latin point of view, the impossible had happened. Jerusalem had fallen. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre could be visited under Latin control. The Crusaders could kneel where they believed Christ had suffered and risen. Their dead could be imagined as vindicated. Their vows could be said to have reached fulfillment. This was why the First Crusade became legend. Against distance, hunger, and military improbability, it succeeded. Later Crusades would try to recover that first radiance, but none would ever possess the same terrifying combination of shock, devotion, and achievement. The First Crusade taught Europe that the idea could work. It also taught Europe that the idea could kill without restraint, and those two lessons traveled together. A preacher could point to Jerusalem and say, God favored the cross. A survivor could point to the same city and say, the cross arrived as fire. Neither memory erased the other. That is why 1099 must be treated not as a simple triumph, but as the first great moral crisis of crusading success. Failure would have discredited the movement. Success made it dangerous. It gave the papacy, nobles, chroniclers, and future generations proof that holy war could change the map. It gave warriors a model. It gave Europe a story powerful enough to repeat. But the victory carried a stain that could not be washed away by procession or prayer. The men who entered Jerusalem believed they had reached the center of sacred history. What they created there was also a frontier state, born in violence, dependent on reinforcements, surrounded by enemies, and forced almost immediately to become more practical than the dream that had summoned it. The crusade had won its city. Now the city had to survive the crusade, and survival would require something very different from the fire of 1099. It would require ports, castles, treaties, money, military orders, local compromise, Italian ships, and a permanent system of defense stretched thin across a hostile and complicated land. Jerusalem had been captured in the name of heaven. The next chapter belongs to the machinery that tried to keep it on earth. Jerusalem had been won by a storm. It would have to be kept by a system. That was the problem the Crusaders discovered almost immediately after 1099. A city taken in the heat of religious triumph did not remain secure simply because men believed God had delivered it. The walls still needed guards. The roads still needed patrols. Fields had to be taxed. Ports had to function. Messages had to move. Horses had to be fed. Castles had to be built and repaired. Local populations had to be governed by rulers who were foreign, few in number, and surrounded by enemies who had not accepted the permanence of Latin victory. The First Crusade had ended as miracle in Western memory. In the East, it became administration. The Latin rulers who stayed behind created what later historians call the Crusader States: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, and the County of Tripoli. These were not identical societies, and they did not all function in the same way. Each sat in a different political landscape, shaped by local communities, neighboring Muslim powers, Byzantine claims, Armenian interests, trade routes, noble rivalries, and the constant uncertainty of reinforcement from the West. But all of them shared one central weakness. They were thin. Thin in manpower, thin in territorial depth, thin in reliable revenue, thin in the distance between confidence and disaster. On a map, the Latin East could look impressive enough. There were cities, castles, titles, ports, banners, seals, and rulers who styled themselves as lords of lands won under the cross. But maps are dangerous when they hide scale. The Latin settlers and ruling elites were a minority in a world far older and more complicated than the crusading imagination had allowed. They governed over and among Muslims, Eastern Christians, Jews, Armenians, Syrians, Greeks, and many others whose loyalties, customs, languages, and survival strategies did not fit neatly into a Latin feudal diagram. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, especially, lived with a strange double identity. It was a sacred monarchy centered on the city of Christ's Passion. It was also a frontier state that needed Italian ships, coastal markets, fortified roads, and professional violence. The early kings understood this. Baldwin I, who ruled from 1100 to 1118, was not merely the custodian of a holy place. He was a state builder under pressure. He expanded Latin control, secured key towns, and tried to turn the shock of conquest into something that could endure. After the first generation of crusaders went home or died, his successor Baldwin II faced the same harsh logic. Sacred prestige could inspire support, but it could not patrol every road. So the Latin East became a place of castles. Fortresses rose not as romantic scenery, but as answers to a demographic problem. If you lack enough men to dominate the countryside continuously, you hold strong points. If you cannot control every road, you guard the crucial ones. If you cannot trust distance, you build stone where flesh is scarce. This is why the visual world of the Crusader States is so powerful. Towers above dry valleys, walls looking down on trade routes, gates thick enough to slow a raid, garrisons waiting under a sun that made iron unbearable. The castles were not only symbols of occupation, they were confessions of insecurity. A confident society does not need to turn every horizon into a watchtower. Yet even castles were not enough. The Latin states needed men who could live permanently inside the logic of holy war. Ordinary crusaders came and went. Pilgrims arrived, prayed, fought perhaps, then returned west if they survived. Noble reinforcements depended on politics, preaching, and crisis. What the frontier required was continuity. From that need emerged the great military orders. The Templars began as a small brotherhood associated with protecting pilgrims on dangerous roads. The Hospitallers grew from a charitable and medical institution into a military power. Later, the Teutonic Knights would become important in other theaters as well. These orders were unsettling because they fused categories medieval society usually kept distinct. They were monks who fought, they took vows, lived under rules, held property, guarded fortresses, moved money, and answered to trans-regional structures that often stood partly outside local royal control. They were the institutionalization of the crusade. A knight could die, A king could fail. A noble family could lose heirs. But an order could accumulate land in Europe, receive donations from the pious, transfer resources east, maintain houses across Christendom, and keep the frontier war alive as a permanent religious profession. This solved one problem and created another. The military orders made defense more durable. They also became powers in their own right. A king of Jerusalem needed them, but need is a form of dependence. A castle held by the Templars or Hospitallers did not simply belong to royal will. It belonged to an institution with its own rules, commanders, wealth, donors, and long memory. The Sacred Kingdom was becoming a network of semi-independent military corporations of faith. That sounds modern. It was medieval. But the underlying logic is familiar. When the central state is weak, specialized institutions gain leverage by doing what the state cannot do alone. The same was true at sea. Without the ports, the Latin East could not survive. Acre, Tyre, Jaffa, and other coastal cities became lifelines. Through them came pilgrims, horses, grain, weapons, messages, merchants, craftsmen, priests, nobles, and fresh crusading enthusiasm. Through them also moved goods that made the Eastern Mediterranean economically attractive. Spices, textiles, sugar, glass, dyes, metalwork, and the profits of long-distance exchange. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa understood this world with cold clarity. They did not come only as servants of the sacred cause. They came as maritime powers whose fleets could sustain or strangle the movement of men and goods. In return for naval support, transport, and commercial participation, they received privileges, quarters in cities, tax advantages, trading rights, legal protections, and influence. The Latin East therefore survived through a bargain. It needed merchants to remain connected to Europe. The merchants needed access, profit, and protection. In a harbor like Acre, the crusade no longer looked like a sermon. It looked like cargo. Imagine a merchant standing near the docks in the early 12th century. Salt air, wet rope, sailcloth cracking in the wind, men shouting in several languages. A crate of spices is opened, wax is weighed. A pilgrim asks directions to the holy places. A Templar rides past with dust on his cloak. Somewhere a clerk notes a fee, a privilege, a debt, a shipment, a name. The air smells of fish, sweat, pitch, and money. This was also the crusade, not only the charge at Jerusalem, not only the kneeling knight, not only the cross sewn onto wool. The crusade became harbor administration, customs exemptions, convoy protection, armed orders, fortified warehouses, treaties with Italian communes, and quarrels over who profited from the sacred frontier. The Holy Land was not floating above commerce. It was being financed through it. This does not mean trade was a corruption added from outside to a pure religious project. The truth is more complicated. Medieval pilgrimage had always required infrastructure. Ships had always needed payment. Food had always moved through markets. Religious devotion and economic exchange were not separate worlds. A pilgrim buying passage was not necessarily a hypocrite. A merchant transporting crusaders was not automatically faithless. But the scale of the Latin East made the relationship sharper. A state built by holy war had to keep asking practical questions. Who brings the next ship? Who funds the next castle? Who lends money to a lord short of cash? Who supplies grain when harvests fail? Who escorts pilgrims through dangerous roads? Who has the right to tax a market? Who owns the street where foreign merchants live? The more the system depended on these answers, the less the original language of salvation could explain what was actually happening. And beneath the rulers, orders, merchants, and castles lived the local people. They were not background. For a Muslim farmer near a Latin-held town, the Crusader States might appear not as a grand Christian epic, but as a new layer of taxation and insecurity. For an Eastern Christian villager, Latin rule could bring both opportunity and pressure, depending on place, lord, law, and church politics. For Jewish communities, survival required negotiation with whichever power controlled the city or road. For Arabic-speaking Christians, Armenians, Syrians, Greeks, and others, the Latin newcomers were not simply liberators or occupiers in a single simple sense. They were another ruling class entering an already layered world. The Western Crusader imagination had divided the world sharply. Life in the East was harder to divide. Markets did not function if everyone treated everyone else only as an enemy. Rulers needed revenue from people who did not share their right or language. Local knowledge mattered. Translators mattered. Treaties mattered. Raids and truces could exist within the same generation, sometimes with the same neighbors. The frontier was violent, but it was also practical. That practicality disturbed the purity of crusading rhetoric. In Europe, preachers could describe the war in clean moral lines. In the Levant, a lord might fight a Muslim ruler one year and negotiate with another the next. Alliances crossed religious boundaries when survival required it. Trade continued because people had to eat, travel, and profit. Captives could be ransomed. Doctors, interpreters, and merchants moved between worlds that sermons pretended were absolute opposites. This was not peace. It was coexistence under pressure. The Latin East survived because it learned some of these rules. It also remained vulnerable because it never had the depth to absorb a major coordinated blow. If a field army was destroyed, there were not endless reserves behind it. If a port was lost, the sea connection weakened. If European attention shifted elsewhere, the frontier felt the absence. If Muslim powers became divided, the Latin states could maneuver. If Muslim powers united, every Latin weakness became more dangerous. For several decades, division among surrounding Muslim rulers gave the Crusader states room to breathe. Damascus, Aleppo, Mosul, Egypt, local dynasties, rival leaders. The political world around the Franks was fragmented. The Latin states survived not only because they were brave or blessed, but because their enemies were not always united, and because frontier diplomacy could be as important as battle. This fact rarely fits heroic memory. It is less dramatic to say that a kingdom survived through enemy disunity, harbor privilege, castle networks, local compromise, and institutional adaptation. But it is closer to the truth. The miracle of 1099 had not created a secure order. It had created an exposed system that needed constant maintenance. Every generation had to rebuild the achievement of the first. Every ruler had to convert sacred prestige into practical defense. Every port had to remain open. Every castle had to be supplied. Every order had to keep recruiting and receiving funds. Every appeal to Europe had to make distant people care about a frontier most would never see. That was the burden of the Crusader states. They lived on borrowed time, but borrowed time can last longer than expected when managed carefully. For nearly half a century after Jerusalem's capture, the Latin East endured. It adapted, expanded, fortified, negotiated, and turned crusading victory into a working political order. But the order was never as solid as it looked from the west. Its survival depended on conditions beyond its control. Continued reinforcements, divided enemies, functioning ports, and the fragile belief that Europe would keep paying attention. Then, in 1144, that belief was shaken. Edessa fell. The county of Edessa was the northernmost and most exposed of the Crusader States, a frontier outpost vulnerable to the politics of Syria and Mesopotamia. When Zengi captured it, the news moved west with the force of a theological injury. The first crusading generation had proved God's favor by victory. Now a Latin state had been erased. The question could no longer be avoided. If the crusade had been blessed, why was its world beginning to shrink? The answer would produce the Second Crusade, one of the great humiliations of medieval Christendom. A campaign preached by saints, led by kings, and remembered as the moment when the miracle of 1099 first began to fail in public. The first great crack appeared in the north. Not in Jerusalem, not at the Holy Sepulchre, not in the city whose capture had made the First Crusade feel like proof that heaven had chosen the road of armed pilgrimage. It appeared in Edessa. The county of Edessa was the most exposed of the Crusader states. A frontier lordship stretched into a dangerous political world of Armenian communities, Muslim powers, Latin ambition, local alliances, and shifting loyalties. It did not possess the symbolic power of Jerusalem or the maritime lifeline of the great coastal ports. It was inland, vulnerable, and difficult to reinforce. Its existence depended on the same fragile conditions that sustained the whole Latin East: divided enemies, quicker diplomacy, military readiness, and enough Western attention to keep the frontier from becoming isolated. In 1144, those conditions failed. Zengi, the powerful ruler of Mosul and Aleppo, moved against Edessa while its count, Jocelyn II, was away. The city fell after siege. For the Latin East, this was not just a territorial loss. It was a warning written in fire and broken stone. One of the states born from the First Crusade had been erased. The miracle of 1099 had met its first public contradiction. News traveled west slowly by modern standards, but emotionally it arrived like a blow. Edessa's fall raised a question that no preacher could answer easily. If the crusade had been favored by God, why was its world beginning to shrink? The official answer could not be that the system was fragile. That would have been too cold. A religious society needed religious explanation. Defeat could be interpreted as punishment for sin, a test of faith, a call to repentance, a demand for renewed sacrifice. This did not mean people were stupid or blind. It meant they lived in a world where political events and spiritual meaning were not separate categories. A lost city was not only a strategic problem, it was a moral alarm. The alarm reached Pope Eugenius III, and it found its greatest voice in Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard was not a king, not a general, not a merchant calculating freight, not a prince looking for land. He was a monk, austere, brilliant, spiritually intense, and terrifyingly persuasive. When Bernard preached the Second Crusade, he gave the wounded confidence of Christendom a voice strong enough to move kings. Louis VII of France took the cross. Conrad III of Germany followed. This mattered. The First Crusade had been led by great nobles, but not by the crowned kings of the largest Western monarchies. The Second Crusade would have royal prestige. If the first movement had been miraculous because it was improbable, the second seemed more official, more majestic, more institutionally confident. On the surface, it looked like an answer. In reality, it exposed a deeper weakness. Royal participation did not produce unity. It did not solve distance. It did not make Anatolia easier to cross. It did not create a single command structure capable of turning religious enthusiasm into strategic precision. The Second Crusade carried immense symbolic weight, but symbols cannot protect a column from hunger, ambush, exhaustion, or bad decisions. The German forces under Conrad suffered heavily in Anatolia. The French army under Louis struggled through the same brutal geography that had punished earlier crusaders. Roads, mountains, supply shortages, local hostility, Byzantine suspicion, and military pressure all did their work. The journey east became not a triumphant procession of kings, but a slow demonstration that prestige had limits. Imagine a French knight somewhere on the road through Anatolia, far from the songs that had followed him out of Europe. His cloak is stiff with dust. His horse is thinner than when the journey began. Around him, men mutter about guides, provisions, Greeks, Turks, betrayals, sins, miracles that do not arrive quickly enough. A royal banner still flies. But hunger has a way of making banners look smaller. He may still believe, but belief has begun to feel heavier. When the remnants of the crusading forces finally reached the eastern Mediterranean, the question became what to do. Edessa, the original cause of the expedition, was difficult to recover. The leaders eventually turned toward Damascus in 1148, a decision that has puzzled and angered observers ever since. Damascus was not merely another Muslim city. It had been, at times, a potential counterweight within the politics of Syria. The decision to attack it risked transforming a complicated regional balance into a clearer anti-Frankish alignment. What may have looked, in the heat of counsel and ambition, like a bold strike became a strategic disaster. The siege failed quickly. The crusading armies withdrew in humiliation. For the Latin East, the failure was worse than wasted effort. It damaged relationships, weakened confidence, and helped create conditions in which Muslim political consolidation could become more dangerous. For Europe, it created a theological embarrassment. Bernard had preached, kings had marched, crosses had been taken, prayers had been spoken, and still the campaign ended not in restored Edessa, not in recovered strength, but in suspicion, recrimination, and shame. This was the moment when crusading confidence first failed in public. The First Crusade had produced a story too powerful to ignore. Against impossible odds, the warriors of the cross had reached Jerusalem. The Second Crusade produced the opposite lesson. Even saints could preach, kings could march, and the result could still be failure. The movement now needed explanation. Bernard himself defended the cause by turning attention towards sin and human unworthiness. The failure was not, in this reading, proof that the crusading ideal was false. It was proof that the people who carried it were impure. This was a powerful defense because it made the ideal almost impossible to disprove. If the crusade succeeded, God had blessed it. If it failed, Christians had not been worthy. That logic could preserve faith. It could also prevent learning, because the Second Crusade did not fail only because of sin. It failed through logistics, leadership tension, strategic confusion, regional miscalculation, and the stubborn fact that the Eastern Mediterranean could not be controlled by Western emotion. A campaign preached in Europe entered a world where local politics mattered more than distant imagination. The people of the Latin East understood this better than many Western arrivals. A settler near the northern frontier did not experience Edessa's fall as theological metaphor. He experienced it as geography closing in. A family that had believed the frontier stable enough to plant vines, store grain, or raise children now had to ask which road remained safe. A merchant had to ask whether caravans would still move. A minor lord had to ask whether help would come in time the next time a Muslim army gathered. For them, the failure of the Second Crusade was not only embarrassing, it was frightening. The surrounding Muslim world was changing. Zengi's career had already shown what determined leadership could do. After his death, his son Nur al-Din would continue the work of consolidation in Syria, combining political ambition with the language of jihad in ways that would increasingly challenge the Latin states. The Crusaders had survived for decades partly because their enemies were divided. That advantage was beginning to narrow. The sacred story was being answered by another sacred story. This did not mean the Muslim world instantly became unified. It did not. Rivalries remained, ambitions competed, and politics often mattered as much as religion. But the presence of the Crusader States helped sharpen the appeal of resistance. As Latin Christendom had learned to frame war as sacred duty, Muslim rulers could also use religious legitimacy to mobilize, unify, and judge. The frontier was becoming ideological on both sides, and ideology, once attached to political consolidation, is far more dangerous than outrage alone. After Damascus, the Latin East remained alive. Jerusalem still stood under Latin rule. The coastal cities still functioned. The military orders continued to strengthen their fortresses and networks. Pilgrims still came. Merchants still traded, kings still ruled. The system had not collapsed, but something had changed. The aura of inevitable blessing had been damaged. The First Crusade could still be remembered as miracle, but it could no longer guarantee repetition. Future crusades would march under the weight of comparison, always trying to recover the first success. Always haunted by the possibility that God's favor could not be summoned on command. That is what made Edessa and Damascus so important. They did not end the Crusades. They ended innocence about crusading success. A city had fallen. A royal expedition had failed. A saint's preaching had not produced victory. The Latin East had been reminded that its survival depended on more than memory, and Europe had been reminded that pious enthusiasm could carry armies only so far. The next great answer would not come from a Western king. It would come from the Muslim world itself, through a line of rulers who understood that the Crusader States could be defeated not merely by raids, but by Gingi had opened the crack. Nur al-Din widened it, and from the world they helped create would rise the man who turned Latin fear into catastrophe. Saladin. The road to Hattin was a road without mercy. In July 1187, the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem moved through heat that did not feel like weather so much as judgment. Dust clung to faces, armor trapped the sun, horses suffered first, then men. Water was no longer a detail of the march. It was strategy itself. Some battles are decided before swords meet. Hattin was one of them. To understand why the Crusader army marched toward disaster, we have to look beyond the field. The defeat was not only the result of one hot day, one bad command, or one reckless king. It was the moment when decades of structural weakness became visible all at once. Divided leadership, exposed territory, overconfidence in sacred symbols, dependence on a limited field army, and the rise of a Muslim ruler who had learned to turn patience into power. That ruler was Saladin. By the time Latin Christians in the East faced him as their greatest enemy, Saladin had already done the hardest political work. He had built a coalition large enough to make the Crusader States feel surrounded. He was not simply a warrior riding out of legend. He was a statesman operating in a fractured Muslim world, a man whose power depended on Egypt, Syria, legitimacy, military command, and the ability to present his rule as more than personal ambition. The foundations had been laid before him. Zengi had shown how dangerous northern Muslim power could become. Nur al-Din, Zengi's son, had expanded that project, strengthening the language of jihad and political consolidation against the Latin states. Saladin inherited part of that world, but he also transformed it. From Egypt, where he rose through the politics of the Fatimid Caliphate and then abolished it in favor of Sunni authority, he moved into the broader struggle for Syria. By the 1180s, he had done what the Crusader States feared most. He had connected enough territories and loyalties to make their old advantage. Enemy division, far less reliable. For the Latin East, this was a nightmare disguised as geography. Jerusalem had always been vulnerable. The kingdom needed roads, ports, castles, military orders, and a careful balance of diplomacy and force. It could survive when surrounding powers competed with one another. It could not easily survive when a ruler with resources in Egypt and Syria could coordinate pressure across multiple fronts. Yet the kingdom itself was not united. After the death of King Baldwin IV, the so-called leper king, the politics of Jerusalem became increasingly unstable. Baldwin IV had been physically weakened by disease but politically formidable in ways later memory often recognized. His death left succession tensions and factional struggle. By 1187, Guy of Lusignan sat on the throne, but his authority was contested and fragile. Around him stood powerful men with competing visions. Raymond III of Tripoli, Balian of Ibelin, the military orders, court factions, and aggressive frontier lords, whose actions could provoke crises larger than the kingdom could contain. One of the most notorious was Reynald of Châtillon. Reynald was bold, violent, and difficult to restrain. His attacks on Muslim caravans and threats toward the Red Sea world became part of the rising crisis. To Saladin, Reynald was more than a troublesome lord. He represented the kind of Latin aggression that could be used to justify a decisive campaign. In a frontier society, one man's raid could become another ruler's moral and political opportunity. The kingdom needed discipline. It had provocation. When Saladin moved in 1187, he did not simply rush at Jerusalem. He applied pressure in a way that forced the Latin leadership into a dangerous decision. Tiberias came under threat. The Crusader army gathered at Sephoria, where water was available and position was safe. The question was whether to remain there or march across dry ground toward Tiberias. Raymond of Tripoli, whose own wife was in Tiberias, reportedly advised caution. His position was not sentimental weakness, it was strategic realism. If the army stayed near water, Saladin might struggle to force the decisive battle he wanted. If the army marched, it would expose itself to heat, harassment, thirst, and exhaustion. Guy chose to march. The reasons were political as much as military. A king whose legitimacy was fragile could not easily appear passive while a major fortress and noble household were threatened. Pressure from more aggressive voices mattered. Honor mattered. The expectation that a king should act mattered. In a Crusader kingdom built on sacred warfare, caution could look like cowardice. So the army left water behind. That decision killed more than men. It killed options. As the Crusader forces moved, Saladin's troops harassed them, controlled access to water, and shaped the rhythm of the march. The Latin army became increasingly exhausted. Near the horns of Hattin, the trap closed. Fires were set in the dry brush. Smoke and heat intensified the suffering. Men who had marched under the protection of the true cross, the great relic carried with the army as a sign of divine favor, found themselves trapped between thirst, enemy pressure, and collapsing order. Imagine a foot soldier on that slope, no longer thinking in the language of chronicles. His mouth is dry enough to hurt. The leather strap under his chin rubs raw against skin. Smoke moves low across the ground. Somewhere ahead, men shout for water. Somewhere behind, a horse screams. The true cross may be near the army, but from where he stands, holiness has become hard to distinguish from heat, dust, and panic. He does not need to understand grand strategy. His body understands the defeat first. On July 4th, 1187, the army of Jerusalem was destroyed at Hattin. The consequences were immediate and devastating. The kingdom's field army, the force that allowed castles and cities to feel connected to a larger defensive system, had been shattered. Guy of Lusignan was captured. Many nobles were taken. The true cross was lost. Reynald of Chatillon was executed by Saladin after the battle, an act remembered through sources shaped by both political meaning and moral judgment. The loss of the true cross struck the Latin world not simply as a military disaster, but as a symbolic reversal. The First Crusade had taught Latin Christendom to read victory as divine favor. Hattin forced it to confront the opposite possibility. What did it mean when the relic marched with the army and the army was annihilated? What did it mean when the kingdom founded to protect the holy places lost the one force that could protect itself? For Saladin, Hattin opened the road. City after city became vulnerable. Many surrendered, some resisted. The logic was brutal but clear. Without the field army, isolated strongholds had to measure courage against probability. The coastal cities still mattered, and some would remain in Latin hands, but the inland structure of the kingdom was broken. Then came Jerusalem. The city that had been taken by the Crusaders in 1099 now faced a Muslim ruler whose victory carried immense religious and political significance. Saladin's recovery of Jerusalem would not merely be a conquest. It would be the reversal of the First Crusade's defining achievement. Inside the city, Balian of Ibelin emerged as a key figure in the defense and negotiation. The situation was desperate. The city lacked the strength to withstand a long, successful defense against Saladin's forces. The memory of 1099 hung over everything. The inhabitants of Jerusalem knew what had happened when the Crusaders breached the walls almost 90 years earlier. Fear was not abstract. It lived in remembered stories of slaughter. Saladin did not repeat 1099. After siege and negotiation, Jerusalem surrendered on October 2nd, 1187. Many inhabitants were ransomed. Others, unable to pay, faced enslavement or dependence on charity and negotiation. The surrender was not painless, and it should not be romanticized into pure mercy. War remained war. Captivity remained captivity. Loss remained loss. But compared with the massacre of 1099, the recovery of the city under Saladin became part of his reputation for disciplined authority. That reputation mattered. Saladin needed victory to serve legitimacy. He had united power under the banner of jihad, and the recovery of Jerusalem made that claim visible to the entire region. He was not only defeating the Franks, he was answering their sacred story with one of his own. For Latin Christians, the shock was almost unbearable. Jerusalem had been the proof. Now Jerusalem was gone. The city's loss did not simply weaken a frontier kingdom. It struck the imagination of Europe. The holy places that had justified so much sacrifice, preaching, taxation, debt, and blood were no longer under Latin control. The great victory of 1099 had been undone within living memory of the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of those who had built the Crusader States. A messenger carrying the news west did not carry only information. He carried a crisis of meaning. How would preachers explain it? How would kings respond? How could the papacy let the city of Christ's Passion remain in Muslim hands after nearly a century of crusading identity? The loss demanded action because it threatened the emotional foundation of the movement itself. Yet the very scale of the disaster also revealed the limits of the old model. The Latin East had not fallen because its inhabitants stopped believing. It fell because belief had been asked to defend a fragile state against a better positioned, better coordinated enemy at a moment when internal politics pushed the kingdom toward a catastrophic decision. Faith did not fill the waterskins at Hattin. The lesson was as simple as it was humiliating. Saladin's triumph did not end the Crusades, it revived them. Shock has its own power. The fall of Jerusalem produced not silence, but mobilization. In Europe, the response would become the Third Crusade, led by some of the most famous rulers of the age: Frederick Barbarossa, Philip II of France, and Richard I of England. Christendom would not accept the reversal quietly, but the next crusade would enter a world changed by Hattin. The question was no longer whether Latin warriors could reach Jerusalem once. They had already done that. The question was whether even the greatest kings of Europe could recover what had been lost when the sacred kingdom met the hard arithmetic of water, unity, and command. The road now turns to Acre, Asuf, Jaffa, and to the uneasy legend of two men history would never stop pairing together: Richard and Saladin. Acre did not look like legend. It looked like mud, sickness, siege engines, broken ships, rotting animals, and men dying slowly beneath banners that promised glory. By the time the great kings of Europe arrived in the eastern Mediterranean, the war for the Holy Land had already become a test of endurance before it became a test of arms. Jerusalem had fallen in 1187. Europe answered with kings. Frederick Barbarossa, the aging emperor of the Germans, took the cross and led a massive force overland. Philip II of France prepared to sail east. Richard I of England, later called the Lionheart, joined the expedition with the kind of royal theatrical force that medieval memory never forgot. If the First Crusade had been led by princes and great nobles, the Third Crusade seemed to carry the full majesty of Latin Christendom. It was supposed to reverse Hattin. It was supposed to answer Saladin. It was supposed to bring Jerusalem back. But the Third Crusade began by teaching Europe that even the greatest rulers could be humbled before reaching the real objective. Frederick Barbarossa drowned in 1190 while crossing a river in Anatolia. His death shattered the morale and coherence of much of the German expedition. The emperor who had embodied imperial strength never reached Jerusalem. His army, so formidable in expectation, diminished before it could become decisive. That was the first warning. Kings could take the cross. The road could still devour them. By the time Richard and Philip reached the siege of Acre, the city had already become the center of the war. Acre mattered because it was a port, and in the Latin East, a port was not merely a place where ships unloaded goods. It was a throat through which men, horses, weapons, grain, silver, pilgrims, and news could pass. Whoever controlled Acre controlled one of the essential gateways between Europe and the Holy Land. The siege had begun in 1189, when forces loyal to the Latin cause tried to recover the city from Saladin's control. It became a brutal deadlock. Crusaders besieged Acre. Saladin's army surrounded the besiegers. Disease moved through the camps. Hunger and fever worked beside swords. Men who had crossed seas to recover a sacred city found themselves trapped before a coastal fortress, waiting for exhaustion to decide what courage could not. Imagine a sailor near Acre carrying water from the shore toward the camp. The bucket is heavy. The air smells of salt, latrines, sweat, and sickness. He passes men too weak to stand, priests muttering prayers, nobles arguing over precedence, engineers repairing machines, and soldiers staring toward walls that seem to consume human effort without changing shape. In the distance, royal banners move above the camp. Up close, the crusade coughs blood into cloth. When Richard arrived, he brought energy, wealth, discipline, and military talent. He was not merely a figure of later romance. He was a formidable commander, capable of enforcing order, inspiring troops, and reading battlefield danger with cold intelligence. Philip of France was also present. But the rivalry between the two kings never disappeared. Europe had sent power east, but not unity. That mattered. The siege of Acre finally ended in 1191 with the city's surrender to the Crusaders. It was a major achievement. The Latin cause had regained a crucial port. The psychological damage of Hattin had been partly answered. But victory came with bitterness. Disputes over spoils, status, banners, prisoners, and political authority immediately revealed the old problem. Crusading kings could fight the same enemy without fully trusting one another. Philip soon returned to France. Richard remained. That departure changed the emotional shape of the campaign. The Third Crusade, in popular memory, became increasingly a duel between Richard and Saladin, two great warrior rulers facing one another across the coastal roads of Palestine. The truth was less clean. They did not meet in single combat. Their relationship was built through envoys, negotiations, pressure, reputation, illness, calculation, and war. Later storytellers polished the rivalry into chivalric legend, but the underlying contest was strategic. Richard needed the coast. Saladin needed to deny him momentum. After Acre, Richard marched south along the coast toward Jaffa. This was not a reckless dash toward Jerusalem. It was careful, disciplined movement. The army kept near the sea, where ships could supply it. Infantry protected the vulnerable side. Cavalry waited under command. Saladin's forces harassed the march, searching for disorder, fatigue, one break in formation that could become another Hattin. At Arsuf in September 1191, the pressure finally broke into battle. Richard held his army together under repeated attacks until the moment came to counterstrike. The Crusader cavalry charge shattered Saladin's immediate tactical plan and gave Richard a clear battlefield victory. Arsuf mattered because it restored Latin confidence. It showed that Hattin had not made the Crusaders helpless. Under disciplined leadership, the armies of the Cross could still win. But Asuf did not deliver Jerusalem. That is the central tension of Richard's crusade. He won enough to become a legend, but not enough to achieve the sacred objective. The campaign pushed on to Jaffa. Richard repaired defenses, secured positions, and considered the march inland. Jerusalem was close enough to haunt the army. Some crusaders could almost feel the vow pulling them toward it. But a commander must ask questions that pilgrims would rather avoid. Could Jerusalem be taken? If taken, could it be held? Could the army survive away from the coast? What would happen if Saladin avoided total defeat, cut supplies, waited for sickness, and forced another crisis in dry country? The memory of Hattin was not distant. It was a warning written into the landscape. Twice, Richard came near the possibility of moving on Jerusalem. Twice, the strategic reality remained cruel. The city might be captured and then lost again if the Crusaders could not hold the roads, secure water, maintain supplies, and defend against counterattack after many Western fighters eventually returned home. This was not cowardice. It was arithmetic. For many in the army, that arithmetic must have felt unbearable. They had not come only for Acre. They had not crossed the sea to stand near Jerusalem and then turn away. The entire crusading imagination had been built around the holy city. To stop short was to leave the emotional wound open. But Richard understood something the songs preferred to forget. A symbolic victory that cannot be defended may become the seed of a second disaster. Saladin, for his part, was also under pressure. He had recovered Jerusalem and shattered the kingdom at Hattin. But Richard's victories threatened the coast and exposed limits in Saladin's own coalition. His authority depended on maintaining military credibility, managing emirs, sustaining resources, and preventing the Crusaders from turning coastal recovery into a broader restoration. Neither man had unlimited freedom. That is what makes their struggle so compelling. Legend imagines kings as men who impose will on the world. History shows them negotiating with weather, money, disease, politics, allies, enemies, exhaustion, and time. Richard could win battles. Saladin could survive them. The war settled into pressure, raids, negotiations, and sudden violence. In 1192, Saladin's forces attacked Jaffa, and Richard responded with remarkable speed and courage, helping secure the city. It was one of the moments that fed his legend, the king arriving by sea, throwing himself into danger, turning crisis into spectacle. But even brilliance has limits. Richard had problems in Europe. His territories, his rivalry with Philip, and political dangers at home pulled him away. Saladin's world, too, was strained by years of war. Both sides needed an end that could be presented as something other than defeat. The Treaty of Jaffa in 1192 provided that end. The agreement left Jerusalem under Muslim control, but allowed Christian pilgrims access to the holy places. The Crusaders retained a coastal strip, securing a reduced but meaningful Latin presence in the east. It was a practical settlement, perhaps the best available after years of blood and exhaustion. But it was not the victory Europe had imagined. Jerusalem remained beyond Latin rule. This is why the Third Crusade occupies such a strange place in history. It is full of dramatic success. Acre recovered, Asuf won, Jaffa defended, Saladin checked, Christian pilgrimage restored. And yet the central promise remained unfulfilled. The crusade produced glory without completion. For Richard, that meant his reputation could shine even as the mission failed its highest aim. For Saladin, it meant he could preserve the greatest prize of his career, even after suffering setbacks. For the Latin East, it meant survival, not resurrection. The coastal kingdom endured, but the old kingdom of Jerusalem had become a narrower, more maritime, more vulnerable system. The crusading ideal survived because the defeat was not total. It was wounded because the success was incomplete. A pilgrim could once again reach the holy places. That mattered. But access was not sovereignty. Prayer was permitted, but the city was not possessed. The sacred center of the crusading imagination remained in Muslim hands, and that fact would continue to disturb Western Christendom for generations. The Third Crusade proved that Europe could still project power across the sea. It also proved that power was no longer enough. The age of simple miracle had passed. If the First Crusade had seemed to show that suffering and faith could force open Jerusalem, the Third showed that even the finest commanders, royal resources, and tactical victories could be stopped by logistics, politics, and the difficulty of holding what the imagination demanded. Richard sailed away. Saladin remained with Jerusalem. The coast survived. The dream did not die, but it changed shape. It became more strategic, more bureaucratic, more dependent on ports, fleets, credit, and careful planning. Future crusaders would increasingly look not directly to Jerusalem, but to the systems that sustained power in the region, especially Egypt. That shift was practical. It was also dangerous, because once the road to Jerusalem became indirect, it could be redirected. Once a crusade depended on fleets and contracts, it became vulnerable to those who owned the ships. Once holy war required maritime finance, the sacred vow began to pass through ledgers before it reached battlefields. The Third Crusade ended with Jerusalem still out of reach. The Fourth would begin by trying to solve that problem through strategy. It would end by proving that a crusade could lose its soul long before it reached the Holy Land. The most dangerous weapon of the Fourth Crusade was not a sword. It was a contract. Before the army ever reached the walls of Constantinople, before churches were violated and relics carried west, before Latin soldiers stood beneath the domes of the Eastern Roman capital, with loot in their hands, the disaster began in Venice, in shipyards, counting rooms, negotiations, and promises written in ink. The men who planned the Fourth Crusade understood the lesson of earlier campaigns. Jerusalem was not easily recovered by marching straight across Anatolia or Syria. The Third Crusade had shown that even Richard the Lionheart could win battles and still fail to take the Holy City. The strategic mind now looked toward Egypt. Egypt was wealthy. Egypt was the power base that made Jerusalem defensible for the Muslim world. Strike there, and the balance of the Eastern Mediterranean might change. That was the theory. But theory needed ships. Venice could provide them. At the opening of the 13th century, Venice was not merely a city on water. It was a disciplined commercial organism, a republic whose wealth depended on the sea, whose memory was stored in ledgers, whose power grew from the ability to move goods, men, credit, and force across the Mediterranean. Its rulers understood something crusading nobles often treated as secondary. No army crosses the sea because its cause is holy. It crosses because someone builds hulls, supplies crews, gathers food, prepares docks, and calculates cost. The crusade needed transport for thousands of men and horses. Venice agreed to build and supply the fleet. The price was enormous. The bargain itself was not scandalous. A maritime republic providing transport for a crusade made sense. Earlier crusading efforts had also depended on ships and ports. But the scale of this agreement made the army vulnerable from the start. If the Crusaders paid, Venice would be the servant of the Holy Expedition. If they failed to pay, the Holy Expedition would become dependent on Venice. They failed to pay. Fewer Crusaders arrived than expected. Fewer men meant less money. The fleet had been prepared, the resources invested, the Venetian economy partly redirected toward the expedition, and now the army stood before its transport unable to meet the agreed sum. The Crusaders had taken vows to God, but their first great enemy became arithmetic. Imagine a Venetian clerk in 1202, sitting near a table where wax seals and account marks matter more than sermons. Outside, shipwrights have already done their work. Ropes have been tarred, timber has been shaped. Sailors expect wages. Warehouses hold supplies. The Crusaders pray, argue, plead, and promise, but the numbers do not move because a man crosses himself. The debt remains. This was the moment when the Fourth Crusade's soul began to bend. Enrico Dandolo, the aged Doge of Venice, has often been cast as the mastermind of the catastrophe that followed. The truth is more careful and perhaps more disturbing. We do not need to imagine every event as a long conspiracy planned from the beginning. The evidence does not require that. What it shows is something colder. A holy mission placed inside a structure of debt, commercial leverage, political opportunity, and military momentum. A conspiracy would be dramatic. A system is more frightening. The first payment came in the form of Zara. Zara was a Christian city on the Adriatic, contested by Venice and associated with the Hungarian crown. The King of Hungary had himself taken the cross. To attack Zara was to attack a Christian city under the shadow of a crusading vow. Pope Innocent III forbade it. Many within the army understood the moral danger. Some refused to participate, but the army needed Venice. And Venice wanted Zara. So in 1202, Crusaders who had gathered to fight for Jerusalem helped sack a Christian city. The line had been crossed before Constantinople. This is one of the essential truths of the Fourth Crusade. The catastrophe did not arrive suddenly, like lightning out of a clear sky. It developed through decisions that each had a practical explanation. The Crusaders needed ships. They could not pay. Venice offered a way forward. Zara became the price of movement. The papal command condemned the act, but condemnation did not dissolve the debt, feed the army, or carry it to Egypt. The cross had entered the ledger. The ledger won the first round. After Zara, the army stood morally wounded but still mobile. Then Byzantine politics opened the next door. A young Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, son of the deposed Isaac II, promised the Crusaders vast rewards if they helped restore him and his father to the imperial throne. Money, military support, submission of the Byzantine Church to Rome, assistance for the crusade to the Holy Land. The offer was almost too perfect. That was the danger. For the Crusaders, it seemed to solve everything. Their debt could be paid. Their spiritual mission could be revived. The scandal of Zara might be redeemed by future success. For Venice, the diversion toward Constantinople offered commercial and strategic possibilities too valuable to ignore. For Alexios, the crusading army was a weapon he could use to reclaim power. Everyone saw a solution. No one controlled the consequences. Constantinople was not just any city. It was the capital of the Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome in the east, guardian of immense religious and imperial memory. To Latin eyes, it was wealthy, strange, sometimes arrogant, sometimes suspect. Relations between Latin and Greek Christians had long been strained by theology, politics, trade rivalry, language, and mutual contempt. The formal schism of 1054 was only one part of a deeper estrangement. By 1204, mistrust had become habit. When the Crusaders first arrived before Constantinople in 1203, they entered a political world more complex than their bargain had implied. Alexios IV was restored alongside his father Isaac II, but the promised payment became a nightmare. The imperial treasury could not easily satisfy the enormous obligations he had made. The population resented Latin presence. Anti-Latin feeling in the city deepened. Fires damaged parts of Constantinople. The Crusaders waited, unpaid and increasingly hated, outside or near a capital they had supposedly come to help. A promise made in exile met the reality of a city that did not want to pay for it. That gap became fatal. Alexios IV lost control. He was overthrown and killed. Alexios V Ducas took power, presenting himself as defender of the city against the Latin threat. The Crusaders now had a convenient argument. Their ally had been murdered, their payment withheld, their cause betrayed. To men already compromised by Zara and trapped in financial crisis, conquest began to look like justice. It was not justice, it was escalation. In April 1204, the Crusaders attacked Constantinople. The city's sea walls and defenses had guarded it for centuries, but the attackers were aided by Venetian naval skill and the pressure of a determined assault. When the city fell, the result was not a clean transfer of power. It was sack, plunder, violation, humiliation. Churches were stripped. Relics were taken. Palaces were looted. Sacred objects traveled west, sometimes later displayed in Latin churches, as treasures with cleaner labels than their origins deserved. The Fourth Crusade had conquered the greatest Christian city of the East, and it had done so while claiming to serve Christ. Imagine a Byzantine woman standing near a church doorway as Latin soldiers move through the smoke. She cannot know what future historians will call this moment. She does not know that chroniclers will debate intention, blame, Venetian strategy, papal failure, Byzantine instability, Crusader desperation. She knows only the sound: wood breaking, metal striking, mention shouting in languages of other Christian lands. She knows the smell of wax, ash, sweat and fear. She knows that the people who came under the sign of the cross have made the cross look like an enemy. This was the wound 1204 left behind. It did not merely weaken Byzantium materially, though it did that severely. The empire was fragmented. A Latin empire was established in Constantinople. Byzantine successor states emerged in Nicaea, Epirus, and Trebizond. The old imperial structure was broken, and although the Byzantines would eventually recover Constantinople in 1261, the restored empire would never fully regain its former strength. The deeper damage was spiritual and political. The sack made every later appeal for Christian unity more difficult. When Byzantine emperors in later centuries sought Western aid against new enemies, the memory of 1204 stood between them and trust. The Latin West could speak of defending Christendom. The Greek East could remember Latin soldiers in their churches. This is why the Fourth Crusade is more than an episode of misdirection. It is the moral center of the entire crusading tragedy. The First Crusade had shown that holy war could succeed. The Second had shown that it could fail. The Third had shown that even heroic kings could not easily recover Jerusalem. The Fourth showed something darker, A crusade could become so entangled with debt, shipping, dynastic politics, and commercial advantage that it could betray its own sacred category. It did not need to stop using holy language to become corrupt. That was the horror. The language remained. The vows remained. The cross remained on clothing, banners, seals, and speeches. But the direction had changed. Jerusalem had vanished from the center of action. Egypt had been postponed and forgotten. The army that was supposed to fight for the Holy Land had spent its force against Christians. Pope Innocent III was horrified by the sack, even though his own crusading vision had helped create the conditions for the expedition. His authority could condemn what happened, but condemnation after the fact could not restore the city. It could not return stolen relics. It could not unmake the Latin Empire. It could not convince the Orthodox world that papal leadership was safe. This was the limit of spiritual command. A pope could summon a crusade. He could not always govern what the crusade became. The Fourth Crusade therefore reveals the central contradiction that had been growing since Clermont. Once the Church sanctified armed movement across borders, it had to rely on lay powers to execute the mission. Nobles supplied men, merchants supplied ships, rulers supplied legitimacy, cities supplied credit. But each of these actors brought interests that did not disappear beneath the cross. A crusade was never only a prayer with weapons. It was a coalition of incentives. And when those incentives shifted, the sacred mission could be dragged with them. Byzantium paid the price. So did the ideal of Christian unity. So did the moral authority of crusading itself. The movement would continue. New crusades would be preached. Kings would still take the cross. The language of Jerusalem would still burn in European imagination. But after 1204, innocence could no longer be claimed honestly. The broken icon from Constantinople becomes the symbol of the whole story. Not because every crusader was a thief, not because no one believed, but because belief had become capable of traveling beside theft without stopping it. That is a harder truth than simple cynicism. If the Fourth Crusade had been only greed, it would be easier to dismiss. If it had been only faith betrayed by a few villains, it would be easier to contain. Instead, it was a disaster produced by sincere vows, bad finance, political opportunism, commercial leverage, religious arrogance, military pressure, and the momentum of men who had gone too far to admit that the road itself had become corrupted. After Constantinople, the crusading movement did not end. It became more haunting. The Holy Land still called. Jerusalem remained outside durable Latin control. The coastal remnants of the Crusader States still needed help. New strategies would target Egypt again. New leaders would promise that this time, with better planning, better discipline, better faith, the dream could be restored. But the shadow of 1204 followed every later crusade. Because the question was no longer only whether Christians could recover Jerusalem. It was whether the movement that claimed to fight for holiness could still recognize what holiness meant. The next chapter moves into that exhausted later world. Frederick II negotiating where others fought. Louis IX marching with sincere devotion into disaster. Egypt swallowing crusading plans, and Acre waiting at the edge of the sea for the final collapse of the Latin dream. Damietta looked like the answer, at least on parchment. If Jerusalem could not be held by marching straight into the hills of Palestine, then the logic of later crusading turned toward Egypt. Egypt was not merely another target. It was grain, river, wealth, administration, and strategic depth. Control Egypt, and the balance of the Eastern Mediterranean might change. Weaken Egypt, and perhaps Jerusalem could be negotiated, recovered, or defended from a stronger position. That was the theory behind the Fifth Crusade. It was not foolish. It was incomplete. In 1218 and 1219, Crusader forces attacked Damietta, the port city near the mouth of the Nile. The siege was long and brutal. Men fought not only defenders, but mud, disease, heat, insects, river conditions, and the slow decay of morale that settles over armies waiting beside water they do not truly understand. Damietta eventually fell in 1219, and for a moment the old feeling returned. Perhaps this time strategy and faith had joined hands correctly. But victory at a port was not conquest of Egypt. That distinction killed the campaign. The Crusaders faced choices that required discipline, humility, and political clarity. Negotiation was possible. The Ayyubid Sultan al-Kamil offered terms that, according to many accounts, included the return of Jerusalem in exchange for withdrawal from Egypt. The details and timing of proposals have been debated, but the broad crisis is clear. The Crusaders had a chance to treat Damietta as leverage. Instead, pressure pushed them deeper. In 1221, the Crusader army advanced into the Nile Delta. The river, the land, and the enemy closed around them. Flood conditions and strategic miscalculation turned movement into disaster. Supply failed. Retreat became unavoidable. The army surrendered Damietta and left Egypt with nothing durable to show for years of suffering. The Nile had swallowed the plan. A crusade could win a city and still lose the campaign. Imagine a clerk in the Crusader camp trying to keep records in damp air. Parchment curls. Ink thickens. Names of dead men are crossed out or ignored because the list is too long and the command structure too embarrassed. Outside, soldiers scrape mud from boots that will be dirty again within minutes. Priests speak of sin and testing. Commanders speak of timing, water, and lost opportunity. The men had marched to change history. Now history smelled of marsh rot. After Damietta, the crusading movement did not end. It adjusted. It tried again. And the next major effort came from one of the most complicated figures of the Middle Ages, Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor. Frederick was not the Crusader king that preachers preferred. He was brilliant, controversial, multilingual, politically sharp, and deeply entangled in conflict with the papacy. He had delayed his crusading vow long enough to earn excommunication. By the standards of militant piety, he looked suspicious before he ever reached the East. And yet, in 1229, he achieved what many louder crusaders had failed to achieve. He regained Jerusalem, not by storm, by negotiation. Frederick's agreement with al-Kamil restored Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth to Christian control for a limited period, while sensitive Islamic holy sites on the Temple Mount remained under Muslim religious authority. The arrangement was politically practical and spiritually awkward. It gave Latin Christians access to the city they longed for, but it did not resemble the fiery conquest of 1099. There was no great massacre, no apocalyptic charge, no clean heroic script. An excommunicated emperor had obtained Jerusalem through diplomacy. That fact disturbed the crusading imagination. It exposed one of the movement's contradictions. If the goal was truly the recovery of holy places, Frederick had succeeded. If the crusade also needed to look like sacred violence, his success felt wrong. A city recovered by treaty did not feed the same emotional hunger as a city taken by the sword. The result was fragile from the beginning. Jerusalem in 1229 was a symbolic prize without a secure military foundation. It depended on treaty terms, regional politics, and balances that could change quickly. The city had been recovered, but not embedded inside a powerful, durable Latin state. The old problem remained. Possession was not the same as security. In 1244, Jerusalem was lost again, this time to Khwarezmian forces allied in the shifting politics of the region. The city was devastated. The Latin hold over the sacred center was broken. The temporary success of Frederick's diplomacy had revealed its limit. The dream could still be touched. It could not be held. Then came Louis IX of France. If Frederick was the uncomfortable diplomat, Louis was the sincere crusader king, devout, disciplined, morally serious, and committed to the idea that Christian kingship required sacrifice. He was not a cynical adventurer. He was not merely chasing profit or glory. In him, the old crusading ideal still burned with genuine force. That is what makes his failure so revealing. Louis led the Seventh Crusade against Egypt in 1248. Once again, the strategy focused on the Nile. Once again, Damietta fell, this time in 1249. Once again, early success created confidence that the campaign might finally break the pattern. But Egypt did not yield because one port fell. The army moved toward Mansoura, and there the old enemies of crusading returned. Terrain, disease, overextension, political miscalculation, and the gap between pious confidence and local reality. In 1250, the campaign collapsed. Louis was captured. His army suffered heavily. A ransom had to be paid. The king, who had come as the model of Christian devotion, became a prisoner in the land he had hoped to conquer. No scene better captures the exhaustion of late crusading. A king could be sincere. Sincerity could still be defeated. Louis did not abandon the ideal. After his release, he remained for years in the eastern Mediterranean, strengthening what could be strengthened, supporting the Latin presence, and trying to act as the kind of ruler the movement needed. But he could not reverse the larger pattern. The Crusader States were shrinking in possibility. Muslim powers were not simply reacting anymore. They were consolidating, learning, and preparing to eliminate the remaining Latin footholds. The rise of the Mamluks changed the final phase of the story. The Mamluks were not temporary opponents. They were a military regime with formidable discipline, resources, and strategic focus. Leaders such as Baybars, Kalawun, and later Al-Ashraf Khalil understood that the Latin coastal strongholds were not invincible relics of an earlier age. They were targets. One by one, the remaining fortresses and cities could be reduced. Baybars struck with energy and calculation in the second half of the 13th century, attacking Latin and other regional rivals, reducing castles and tightening the pressure. Kalawun continued the work, and under Al-Ashraf Khalil, the final blow came against Acre in 1291. Acre was no longer just a city. It was the last great concentration of the Latin East's hopes, contradictions, wealth, and fear. Merchants, knights, military orders, clergy, refugees, sailors and civilians all crowded into a space that carried too much history. The old kingdom of Jerusalem had already become largely a coastal remnant. Acre was harbor, fortress, market, memory, and escape route. When the Mamluk siege began, it was not only a military event. It was the closing of a door opened in 1099. Imagine a refugee near the harbor as the walls tremble. Smoke rises behind towers. Bells ring, not in ceremony, but warning. A bundle is tied with shaking hands. Cloth, a coin, perhaps a small icon or family object, whatever can be carried if a ship has room. Around the docks, people push toward the sea, because the sea is now the only road left. Knights still fight. Priests still pray. Merchants still look for cargo and passage. But everyone understands the same truth in different ways. The land is ending. In May 1291, Acre fell to the Mamluks. The consequences were decisive. The great Latin presence on the mainland Levant was effectively over. Some offshore and regional holdings remained for a time, and crusading as an idea would continue in other forms and theaters. But the world created by the First Crusade, the attempt to hold a Latin Christian political order in the Holy Land centered on the legacy of Jerusalem, had reached its terminal point. The fall of Acre did not mean Europe forgot the Crusades. It meant the material foundation of the Levantine crusading dream had collapsed. That distinction matters. Ideas often survive the structures that once made them real. The language of crusade could still be used by popes and kings. It could be redirected to Iberia, the Baltic, heretics, political enemies, and future Eastern projects. The cross could still be preached. Indulgences could still be offered. Military orders could transform. Memories could harden into myth. But after Acre, the old dream had lost its harbor. This is the tragedy of the late Crusades. They were not simply a long decline into failure. They were a series of attempts to solve the same problem through different methods: siege, strategy, diplomacy, royal piety, Egyptian campaigns, fortified endurance, and desperate defense. Each method achieved something. None restored the first impossible triumph. Damietta showed that taking a port was not enough. Frederick showed that diplomacy could recover a symbol without securing a system. Louis showed that sincere holiness could still drown in logistics. Acre showed that even the strongest remnant could fall when the surrounding world no longer allowed it to survive. By 1291, the Crusades had not ended as an emotion. They had ended as a territorial project in the Holy Land. The ships that carried survivors away from Acre did not carry away the idea. They carried away the proof that the idea had failed to hold stone, fields, roads, markets, and walls against time. And that leads to the final question. If the Crusades failed to keep Jerusalem, why did they matter so much? The answer lies not only in what they lost, but in what they left behind. Wealth, wounds, myths, institutions, trade routes, hatred, memory, and a language of sacred violence that proved far more durable than any Crusader kingdom. After Acre fell, the harbor did not become silent at once. Silence comes later. First, there would have been shouting, splintered wood, smoke moving over broken walls, the scrape of hurried footsteps, the cries of people searching for ships, the panic of those who understood too late that the sea could not save everyone. Crates lay smashed near the docks. Ropes dragged through dust and blood. A torn cross banner might still hang somewhere in the wind, no longer a sign of conquest, but of evacuation. In 1291, the Latin dream on the mainland Levant ended not with a sermon, but with a port collapsing under siege. That is the first irony, a movement that began by imagining Jerusalem as the center of the world ended by crowding toward ships. The Crusades did not fail because Europeans stopped believing in them. They failed in the Holy Land because belief could no longer hold the material structure together. The castles were too exposed. The manpower was too thin. The ports were vulnerable. The surrounding powers had changed. The Mamluks had the discipline, resources, and strategic determination to finish what earlier Muslim rulers had not fully completed. By the time Acre fell, the old Latin East had become a memory defended by walls that could no longer carry the weight placed upon them. But if we end the story there, we misunderstand the Crusades. The territorial project in the Holy Land collapsed. The crusading idea did not. It survived because it had become more than a campaign. It was a language, an institution, a habit of thought, a financial system, a political tool, and a memory that could be reshaped for new enemies. Once the papacy learned that war could be preached as penance, the idea proved difficult to bury. It could move. It could be redirected. It could be applied to Iberia, the Baltic, heretics in southern France, political enemies, and later projects that borrowed the emotional force of Jerusalem, even when Jerusalem itself was no longer the immediate battlefield. That is one of the Crusades' most unsettling legacies. They failed to keep the Holy City. They succeeded in teaching Europe how powerful sacred violence could be. The military orders show this clearly. The Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights were born from the needs of crusading warfare, pilgrimage protection, frontier defense, and permanent mobilization. After the loss of the mainland Levant, they did not simply vanish. Institutions rarely die when the battlefield that created them disappears. They adapt, accumulate property, seek new roles, and carry their old legitimacy into new circumstances. The Hospitallers would move through later Mediterranean strongholds. The Teutonic Knights would become deeply tied to crusading in the Baltic. The Templars, wealthy and powerful, would eventually be destroyed in the early 14th century under accusations shaped by royal need, fear, and political theater. Their fall belongs to another story, but it reveals something important. Crusading institutions could become so rich, so transnational, and so symbolically charged that kings feared them as much as they once needed them. The Crusades also changed commerce. Carefully, this must not be exaggerated. The Crusades did not single-handedly make Europe rich. Europe's economic growth came from many forces: agricultural change, urban growth, trade expansion, demographic shifts, banking, craft production, political consolidation, and more. But crusading did help intensify Mediterranean connections. It strengthened the role of maritime cities such as Venice, Genoa, and Pisa. It increased movement of ships, credit, pilgrims, soldiers, goods, and information across the sea. It made ports into strategic lifelines and commercial engines. Faith sailed with cargo. Relics moved with spices. Pilgrims shared ships with merchants. A Venetian or Genoese trader did not need to hate the Crusade ideal to profit from it. He only needed to understand that devotion creates movement, and movement creates markets. Passages had to be booked, food had to be supplied, loans had to be arranged, privileges had to be negotiated, warehouses had to be built. In that world, the holy cause became entangled with the rise of maritime capitalism. The ledger never replaced the cross. It learned to travel beside it. This is why 12:4 remains so central to the whole story. The sack of Constantinople was not only a crime of soldiers against a city, it was the moment when East-West Christian distrust hardened into historical memory. The Byzantine Empire recovered Constantinople in 1261, but it did not recover the same strength. The wounds left by Latin conquest deepened suspicion. Later Byzantine appeals for Western help against new Turkish power would always carry the shadow of betrayal. A broken alliance can be repaired on paper. Memory is harder. In the Islamic world, too, the Crusades left layered memory. For some contemporary Muslim writers, the Franks were one threat among many in a politically divided world. Over time, as figures such as Zengi, Nur al-Din, Saladin, and the Mamluks turned resistance into a language of legitimacy, the struggle against the Crusader States became part of a larger story about defense, piety, rule, and unity. Later generations would remember the Crusades through their own political needs, sometimes sharpening them into symbols far beyond the immediate medieval context. No civilization remembers cleanly. Memory recruits the dead for new arguments. Inside Europe, the Crusades produced triumph, shame, nostalgia, and denial. Chronicles celebrated sacrifice and victory. Sermons called for renewal. Families remembered men who never returned. Jewish communities remembered 1096 not as a footnote, but as catastrophe. Eastern Christians remembered 1204 as betrayal. Muslim communities remembered invasion, resistance, and recovery. Merchants remembered roots. Kings remembered the usefulness of sacred language. The same movement left many archives of pain. Imagine a monk decades after Acre, copying a chronicle by candlelight. His hand moves slowly over parchment. He must choose words for men who marched east long before he was born. Were they pilgrims, warriors, martyrs, sinners, liberators, thieves? The answer depends on which page he copies, which patron supports the monastery, which story his world needs to preserve. Outside his window, the Holy Land is no longer held by Latin kings. But on the page, the crusade still fights. That is how history survives political defeat. It becomes narrative. It becomes example. It becomes warning or inspiration, depending on who tells it. The Crusades became a mirror in which later ages saw whatever they wanted. Christian heroism, medieval barbarism, imperial aggression, spiritual devotion, cultural contact, economic expansion, religious hatred, chivalric adventure, colonial violence. None of those meanings alone is enough. The truth is more uncomfortable because it refuses to separate the noble from the brutal. There were people who genuinely believed they were sacrificing for God. There were people who used that belief for land, profit, prestige, and power. There were rulers who tried to discipline violence by giving it a holy direction. There were communities destroyed when that direction expanded. There were cities enriched by the movement of men and goods. There were cities burned by the same movement. The Crusades were not one thing. That is why they endured in memory. They were a holy vow and a shipping contract, a pilgrimage and a siege, a sermon and a massacre, a relic procession and a ransom negotiation, a dream of Jerusalem and a broken icon in Constantinople. If they teach one lesson about power, it is this: the most dangerous political ideas are often those that make people feel morally innocent while they do violence. That does not mean every crusader was a hypocrite. It means sincerity is not enough to protect a cause from corruption. A man can kneel sincerely before an altar and still burn a city. A pope can preach reform and still unleash forces he cannot govern. A merchant can fund transport and still bend the holy road toward profit. A king can march for salvation and still leave behind famine, debt, and prisoners. The tragedy of the Crusades is not that faith existed. The tragedy is that faith was made to carry war, commerce, ambition, fear, and conquest. and then was asked to remain pure under the weight. It could not. By 1291, the Latin banners had fallen from Acre's walls. Jerusalem was not a Latin capital. The Crusader States of the mainland Levant were gone, but the language invented and refined across those 2 centuries remained available. The enemy of God, the holy campaign, the sanctified sword, the promise that violence could heal the soul, if only it was aimed correctly. That language would echo far beyond the beaches of the Levant, and perhaps that is the darkest legacy. The Crusades did not leave only castles, chronicles, trade privileges, relics, bitterness, and myth. They left a warning about what happens when human beings place their violence inside a story too sacred to question. Return finally to Constantinople in 1204. A broken icon on the floor. A soldier with a cross on his cloak. A church filled with smoke. That image does not contain the whole history of the Crusades, but it reveals the wound at their center. The war that claimed to defend holiness became powerful enough to violate it. The movement that promised salvation taught Europe new ways to organize violence. The dream of Jerusalem made merchants richer, popes stronger, kings more theatrical, and ordinary people, Christians, Muslims, Jews, and others, are more vulnerable to the decisions of men who believed heaven had authorized the road beneath their feet. Acre fell. The ships left, the idea remained, and that is why the Crusades still disturb us. Not because medieval people were uniquely cruel, but because they show how easily cruelty can become righteous when wrapped in the language of the sacred. If you want the next chapter in this series, tell us which dynasty, empire, or sacred system should face the judgment of history next. Because history is not only a list of dates, it is the autopsy of power, and sometimes the things buried deepest are the things still breathing.